I woke up to the smell of iodine and the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. The fluorescent lights overhead burned through my eyelids before I could even force them open. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed with crushed glass. I tried to shift my weight, but a rigid cervical collar locked my neck in place, and a web of intravenous lines anchored my left arm to the metal bed rail. Through the small window, the Chicago skyline stood indifferent against the night sky. My phone rested on the rolling tray table next to a plastic water pitcher. The screen was dark. Reaching it required a slow, agonizing slide of my right hand, navigating the tangle of medical tubing. My fingers were numb, but I found the charging cable taped to the monitor stand and guided it into the port. I lay there breathing in shallow gasps, watching the battery icon flash. When the screen finally glowed to life, notifications cascaded across the glass. One text message sat pinned at the very top. It was from my brother Declan. "We transferred your $318,000 savings to cover Dad's gambling debt. You were unconscious, so Mom signed your name. The bank already processed it." The words sat there on the glowing rectangle, sterile and neat. My life savings, accumulated through 80-hour weeks of forensic accounting, erased, while a machine kept my lungs moving. If your own blood has ever looked at your success as their personal emergency fund, you know the exact coldness spreading through my chest right now. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, where we dissect the moments families mistake silence for surrender and where the quiet ones finish what the loud ones start. Before I show you how a bedridden woman dismantled a corporate theft, drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. A normal person might have hit the call button and demanded a phone to scream at their mother. I did not cry. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached, but my heart rate on the monitor did not spike. I spend my life dismantling offshore tax havens and tracing ghost ledgers for corporate litigators. I assess risk. I calculate. Illinois Heritage Bank holds my high-yield accounts. A 6-figure wire transfer requires dual-factor authentication. A physical signature on a forged power of attorney form is not enough to move that kind of capital. The fraud department always issues a secondary verification code to the account holder's registered mobile device. My phone had been dead in a plastic hospital evidence bag since the paramedics pulled me from the wreckage of a crushed sedan on Interstate 90. Declan did not make a desperate last-minute decision to save our father. The timeline was physically impossible unless someone intercepted that verification text. He had to have cloned my SIM card or accessed my secondary work phone while I was bleeding out in emergency triage. This was premeditated digital theft orchestrated while they waited to see if I would survive the night. A night nurse stepped into the room, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the linoleum. She offered a sympathetic smile and reached for the pain medication drip. "I do not need the morphine," I said, my voice scraping against my dry throat. "I need my surgical chart, specifically the exact minute the anesthesiologist logged my intubation." She paused, her hand hovering over the plastic tubing. "Honey, you just woke up from a severe trauma. The doctor will be in to talk to you." The exact minute, I repeated, locking my eyes on hers. And a pen. She blinked, unnerved by the flat tone of my voice, but turned to the terminal in the corner of the room. The printer began to whir. While she pulled the paperwork, I used my good hand to navigate to the Illinois Heritage Bank application on my phone. If Declan had moved the money, I needed the routing number of the receiving institution. I needed the digital breadcrumbs. Face ID bypassed the lock screen. The interface loaded, but the dashboard did not show my checking or savings balances. Instead, a solid red banner dominated the screen. "Account frozen due to suspicious activity. Please contact your branch administrator." My thumb hovered over the glass. My chest tightened against the rigid brace. They had not just drained the savings account. Someone had proactively locked my entire financial profile. I was lying in an intensive care unit with a fractured collarbone, tethered to a wall by plastic tubes, and my operational capital was exactly zero. The board was set, and my family thought they had already won. They forgot who taught them how to play. I stared at the crimson warning banner glowing on my screen. Account frozen due to suspicious activity. To an ordinary customer, that red stripe looks like a digital shield, a comforting sign that the bank's security algorithms are watching over their hard-earned money. To a forensic accountant, it looks entirely different. It is a siege tactic. In corporate warfare, freezing a target's operational capital is the first step to starving them out before litigation can even begin. My mother had not just forged my name to authorize the outward wire. Someone had flagged my remaining accounts, locking me out of my checking, my emergency fund, and my automated bill pay. I had zero liquidity. I could not pay a retainer to a lawyer. I could not hire a private investigator. I could not even order a food delivery to this hospital room. I used my good hand to navigate away from the banking application and open my contacts. I found the number for Gregory. Gregory was the senior branch manager at Illinois Heritage Bank. He was also a fixture at the Oak Brook Country Club, a man who spent his Thursday afternoons slicing golf balls into the sand traps alongside my father. Gregory liked tailored suits, expensive scotch, and projecting an aura of quiet paternal authority. I pressed the call button and held the phone against my ear, listening to the dial tone over the hiss of the ventilator beside my bed. He answered on the third ring. His voice was smooth, coated in that polished customer service veneer reserved for high net worth clients. Carson Gregory said, letting out a practiced sigh of relief, "Your mother told us about the accident. We have all been praying for you. How are you holding up?" I ignored the hollow sympathy. "Gregory, my accounts are locked. And according to a text from Declan, a $318,000 outward wire was processed yesterday afternoon. I need you to reverse the transfer and lift the freeze on my operational funds." The silence on the line stretched just a fraction of a second too long. It was the hesitation of a man caught off guard by a patient who should be groggy and weeping, not issuing financial directives. "Now, Carson, let us not rush into anything while you are medicated," Gregory said. His tone dropped an octave, adopting the soothing, patronizing cadence of a father scolding a confused child. "I placed that freeze on your remaining balances myself for your own protection. When your mother came in with the emergency power of attorney, we pushed the wire through to help your family, but I wanted to make sure your day-to-day accounts were secure until you recovered." He was speaking in circles, wrapping a financial blockade in the language of customer care. "I did not sign a power of attorney," I said, keeping my breathing shallow to minimize the friction against my fractured collarbone. "And I did not authorize the liquidation of my savings. It is a fraudulent transfer. Reverse it." "Carson, you are under a tremendous amount of stress," Gregory countered, his voice hardening just a fraction. "The paperwork was entirely in order. The signature was notarized. Your mother was frantic about your father's situation. We bypassed the standard holding period as a courtesy to your family. I cannot simply pull back a six-figure wire because you are having a post-surgical disagreement with your parents." I looked at the printed medical chart resting on my tray table. The black ink on the white paper was the only anchor of truth I had left. "What time did the physical paperwork cross your desk, Gregory?" I asked the question slowly, letting the silence hang. There was a shuffle of paper on his end. He was checking his digital ledger, confident in his bureaucratic shield. "The wire authorization was signed and logged at 2:14 yesterday afternoon." I read the surgical timestamp on the page in front of me. "At 2:14 yesterday afternoon," I said, my voice dropping to a flat, clinical register. "My chest cavity was open on an operating table at Northwestern Memorial. I was under general anesthesia. An intubation tube was securing my airway. I have the anesthesiologist's timestamp sitting on my lap right now. So unless I astral projected into your lobby, that signature is a forgery. You processed a fraudulent six-figure wire." I heard a sharp intake of breath through the receiver. Gregory's paternal authority fractured. The liability he was facing was staggering. Facilitating a forged transfer of that size was grounds for immediate termination, severe federal fines, and the potential loss of his banking license. He should have panicked. He should have immediately offered to call the fraud department and issue a trace on the funds. Instead, his tone turned rigid defensive and alarmingly cold. A notarized document provides the bank with safe harbor Carson. If you want to allege forgery against your own mother, you will need to take that up with local law enforcement. I cannot freeze the receiving account or reverse the funds without a signed court order from a judge. He knew exactly what he was doing. I am confined to an intensive care unit, I said, staring at the Chicago skyline. And you froze my checking account. How do you expect me to retain counsel to secure a court order when I cannot access a single dollar to my name? That is bank policy for contested accounts, Gregory replied, his voice slipping into an automated robotic cadence. We must protect the assets until the legal dispute is resolved. I recommend you speak with your family and sort this misunderstanding out privately. Get some rest, Carson. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone to the mattress. My pulse thrummed a slow, steady rhythm against my cervical collar. Gregory was not just protecting the bank's liability. He was actively stonewalling me. A cautious branch manager would have frozen the destination account the second I mentioned the surgical timestamp. Gregory did the opposite. He demanded a court order he knew I could not afford to procure, buying Declan time to launder the stolen capital through whatever corporate structure he had built. Closing my eyes against the harsh room lighting, a memory surfaced, rising unbidden through the haze of the painkillers. I was 25 years old. It was a humid July evening at a high-end steakhouse in the Loop. I was celebrating my promotion to senior auditor. Declan was 21, sitting across the table, swirling an expensive bourbon he could not afford. He was reckless charming and obsessed with the idea of passive income. He kept asking me how the billionaires I investigated managed to hide their wealth from the government and their ex-wives. I had taken a pen and drawn a diagram on a linen cocktail napkin. I showed him how to establish a blind, limited liability company in Delaware. I explained how to use a registered agent to shield the ownership structure, how to layer shell companies to obscure the paper trail, and how to open a corporate bank account that no creditor could easily trace. I gave him the exact blueprint for corporate invincibility. The irony burned like acid in my throat. My brother was not a financial genius. He was a mimic. He had used my own forensic playbook against me, building a digital fortress with my stolen money, following the exact schematic I drew for him on a steakhouse napkin. But Declan lacked discipline. He was arrogant. If he built the shell company according to my rules, I knew exactly where the structural trapdoors were. I knew how to pierce the corporate veil. I knew how to trace the registered agent. The problem was logistics. To crack his LLC, I needed the raw data. I needed the destination routing numbers from the wire transfer. I needed the exact name of the entity that received my money. That information was sitting in Gregory's locked internal banking system, and Gregory had just made it clear he would rather see me bankrupt than hand over the ledger. I lay in the hospital bed running the variables through my mind. I had no liquid capital to hire a private investigator. I was physically tethered to a wall. I could not walk into the bank and demand my records. I needed an inside man, someone with the access and the arrogance to bring the digital evidence right into this room, placing it directly into my hands. I needed to manipulate the very people who put me here. A soft knock interrupted my planning. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room pushed open. The scent of expensive, out-of-season flowers cut through the sharp odor of hospital antiseptic, signaling the arrival of the one person who could hand me the weapon I needed. The heavy wooden door to my room pushed open. The sharp, clinical scent of hospital antiseptic was instantly overpowered by the sweet, suffocating fragrance of rare blooms. My mother, Patricia Onyx, stepped into the intensive care unit. She looked as though she had just arrived from a charity luncheon, draped in a pristine camel cashmere coat, her ash blonde hair perfectly blown out and resting over her shoulders. In her hands, she carried a heavy crystal vase, holding an arrangement of ghost orchids flowers, so delicate and expensive they felt like a deliberate insult in a room where people were fighting just to breathe. Patricia was a woman who measured love in aesthetics. Growing up in the affluent subdivisions of Naperville, I learned early that a scraped knee was only a tragedy if it bled on the white upholstery. She spent her life curating a flawless suburban facade, shielding my father's mediocrity and my brother's arrogance behind manicured lawns and country club memberships. I was the anomaly, the daughter who moved to the city to scrutinize corporate balance sheets instead of marrying a junior partner at a law firm. She rushed to the side of the bed, her face contorted into a mask of performed anguish. She did not reach for my injured shoulder, nor did she touch the bandages wrapping my ribs. Instead, she hovered, setting the crystal vase on the rolling tray table right next to my printed surgical chart. "Oh, Carson," she whispered, her voice trembling with practiced precision. "My poor, sturdy girl. We have been beside ourselves. Declan said you were awake, but seeing you like this breaks my heart." I stared at the orchids. Their pale petals looked like suspended phantoms under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You look well rested for a woman whose daughter almost died on the interstate," I said, keeping my tone flat and devoid of the warmth she expected to manipulate. The comment caused a microscopic twitch near her left eye, but she recovered instantly, smoothing the lapels of her coat. "We had to be strong for you," Patricia murmured, pulling a vinyl guest chair closer to the bed rail. "And we had to handle the crisis. You have to understand, Carson, the situation with your father." She trailed off, letting the silence imply a grave and looming danger. "He got in over his head. Real trouble. The kind of men who do not just send collection letters. We were terrified. You were in a coma the doctors did not know if you would wake up, and your father was receiving threats." She leaned closer, her expensive perfume clinging to the back of my throat. "It was family duty. We had to make a sacrifice to keep him safe." "You are so successful, Carson. You always bounce back. We knew you would understand why we had to use your emergency funds. It is just money. You can rebuild it." Just money. $318,000. A decade of missing vacations, working 70-hour weeks, and dissecting corporate fraud while she hosted garden parties. She was framing a felony as a noble maternal rescue mission, banking on my lifelong habit of fixing the family messes. But I was no longer the obedient fixer. I was the victim of a premeditated financial heist, and she was the accomplice. "How did you manage it?" I asked, keeping my facial muscles perfectly still. "Gregory told me the paperwork was immaculate." "I am genuinely curious, Mother. How did you execute a 6-figure transfer while I was bleeding out on a gurney?" Patricia straightened her posture. She took the bait. My mother could never resist an opportunity to bask in her own competence. She wanted credit for saving the family. "It was stressful, but I kept a level head," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Declan found the old emergency forms in your home office. I drove to the bank right after they admitted you to surgery. We told Gregory it was a matter of life and death. And the notary," I prompted, my voice barely above a rasp, "banks do not accept medical powers of attorney without a certified seal." Patricia offered a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Oh, Declan handled the legalities. He has a contact from his real estate networking group, a paralegal named Sarah. She works at that little strip mall firm off Route 59. She met us at the branch and stamped the documents. She was very understanding about the urgency of the situation." Sarah, a paralegal off Route 59. My mother had just handed me the weakest link in their fraudulent chain. A corrupt notary who stamped a document without the signatory present was facing immediate disbarment and federal prison time. That woman was my wedge. Patricia reached out and patted the back of my uninjured hand. Her skin was cool, her rings heavy against my knuckles. "We are going to get through this," she said, her tone dripping with toxic sweetness. "Be a good girl and let it go, Carson. Do not make this harder on your father than it already is. Focus on healing." I looked down at her hand resting on mine. Then I looked up into her carefully lined eyes. I did not yell. I did not threaten her with the police. I just smiled. It was a small, cold, synthetic expression, the kind of smile a predator gives right before the trap snaps shut. Patricia withdrew her hand quickly, unsettled by the lack of outrage. She stood up, smoothing her camel coat, suddenly eager to escape the sterile confinement of the intensive care unit. "I will tell Declan you are resting comfortably," she said, retreating toward the heavy wooden door. "We will visit again tomorrow." She stepped into the hallway, the door sealing shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss, leaving me alone with the rhythmic hum of the ventilator. I turned my head toward the tray table. The ghost orchids sat in their crystal vase, a monument to my mother's vanity. Something about them gnawed at the analytical center of my brain. Patricia was a creature of habit. She patronized local Naperville florist establishments where the owners knew her name and kissed her cheek. Ghost orchids were not standard suburban inventory. They required specialty cultivation and overnight shipping. I slid my right hand across the plastic table, hooking my index finger around the small envelope tucked into the floral arrangement. I pulled the heavy cardstock free and flipped it over. The printed logo belonged to an exclusive botanical boutique. The address was located in Wilmington, Delaware. My pulse quickened, sending a dull throb through my fractured collarbone. Why would a Naperville housewife order get-well flowers from a corporate tax haven on the East Coast? Delaware is the undisputed capital of anonymous shell companies. It is where you register a business when you do not want anyone to know who owns the assets. It is exactly where I told Declan to incorporate if he ever needed to hide money from a hostile creditor. Patricia did not buy these flowers with her own credit card. She used the corporate account of the receiving entity, the entity that absorbed my $318,000. She was so addicted to performing wealth, so obsessed with maintaining the aesthetic of a loving mother, that she unwittingly left a direct paper trail to the stolen capital, sitting right on my hospital tray. The money had not vanished into the pockets of a bookmaker. It was sitting in a corporate bank account attached to a Delaware post office box. And now I had a geographical target. If the shell company was registered in Wilmington, I could pull the regional incorporation logs. I just needed to bypass the bank security freeze to access the public records database. But the deeper I dug, the less the story made sense. If my father owed a gambling debt, why was my brother the one building the offshore fortress? Who was actually being threatened? I rested my phone on the edge of my rigid cervical collar to stabilize the screen. The public hospital wireless network was unsecured and painfully slow, but it provided the sole tether to the outside world. With my bank application locked behind Gregory's bureaucratic firewall, I needed a different avenue to trace the anatomy of the theft. I needed to understand the supposed catalyst. My mother claimed my father was drowning in a dangerous gambling debt, threatened by violent men who demanded immediate restitution. If Richard Onyx was being extorted, there would be a digital footprint. Paranoia always leaves a trail. I opened a mobile browser and navigated to the administrative portal of our telecommunications provider. Years ago, I consolidated our family cellular plan under my own corporate account to secure a premium data tier. Richard had just lost his senior management title at a regional logistics firm. He called his unemployment a brief career transition, a temporary restructuring of his portfolio. That was 6 years ago. I kept paying the monthly statement, allowing him to maintain the illusion of financial independence. I never revoked my administrative access. Typing with my left thumb, I entered my credentials and bypassed the security prompt. The dashboard loaded, displaying the data usage and text message logs for all 4 lines on the account. I selected my father's number and filtered the outgoing communications from the past 3 weeks. The screen populated with hundreds of entries. Most were mundane transmissions to my mother or automated alerts from his country club. But starting mid-month, a distinct pattern emerged, a concentrated barrage of texts, escalating in frequency and time-stamped late into the night, were sent to a single, unlisted contact, saved only as V. Rossi. The volume of messages spiked dramatically 3 days before my car accident. Richard sent 12 texts in a single hour. The recipient responded only twice. My analytical training kicked in, suppressing the dull ache radiating from my fractured collarbone. V. Rossi. The initial assumed the shape of a shadow figure, a suburban bookmaker running illegal sports wagers out of a dimly lit back room. I copied the 10-digit phone number into a separate browser tab and accessed a commercial real estate registry, a database I frequently utilized to pierce corporate veils during financial audits. The search engine digested the digits. The loading wheel spun for 3 agonizing seconds before rendering the results. There was no underground gambling ring. There was no organized crime syndicate threatening to break my father's legs. The phone number was registered to Vincenzo Rossi, the proprietor of Rossi Vintage Cellars, an elite wine brokerage located in the Gold Coast neighborhood of downtown Chicago. I stared at the search results, reading the high-end boutique's business prospectus. Vincenzo Rossi imported exclusive, limited production European vintages for private collectors. I pulled a secondary civil court database and cross-referenced my father's name with the brokerage. The ledger hit immediately. Rossi Vintage Cellars had recently filed a preliminary civil claim against Richard Onyx for breach of contract on an unpaid invoice. The total debt was exactly $15,000. It was an outstanding balance for 2 cases of vintage French Bordeaux. A cold, terrifying clarity settled over my chest. My father was not a degenerate gambler entangled with dangerous criminals. He was an aging narcissist who purchased luxury wine he could not afford to impress fellow country club members who did not actually care about him. His terrifying addiction was nothing more than shallow, performative consumption. The revelation made the betrayal infinitely worse. A $15,000 wine invoice did not require liquidating a $318,000 savings account. The financial math was glaringly disproportionate. Richard was merely a convenient smokescreen, a pathetic excuse weaponized by my mother and brother to justify draining my assets. 30 miles east of my hospital room, the architect of that weaponization stood inside a glass-walled office in the Loop. Declan adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, staring down at the bustling Chicago traffic far below his venture capital firm. He had always been the golden child, the son who traded on charm and unearned confidence, while I handled the unglamorous mechanics of actual labor. He projected the image of a visionary tech founder securing early-stage funding rounds based on charisma rather than viable software. But the capital was drying up. His investors were demanding returns, and his burn rate was catastrophic. He turned away from the window to face a young, nervous systems administrator standing near the conference table. "I need the server migration completed by midnight," Declan instructed, his tone clipped and authoritative. The technician shifted his weight, holding a tablet tight against his chest. "We can push the data transfer tonight, Mr. Onyx, but the internal security protocols usually require a mandatory archiving process. It keeps a mirror of the old IP routing logs for compliance." Declan shook his head, offering a practiced, reassuring smile that did not reach his eyes. "Skip the mirror. This is a clean, structural pivot. I want the old routing logs wiped during the transfer. Erase the history. Start fresh tomorrow morning." The technician nodded, entirely unaware he was being instructed to destroy digital evidence of a federal wire fraud. Declan turned back to the window, exhaling a slow breath of relief. He felt insulated. He believed the narrative was secure. His sister was incapacitated in a hospital bed. The bank manager had frozen her out of her own accounts, and the physical funds were safely hidden inside a corporate maze. He thought he had severed the connection between the crime and the capital. He did not realize his sister was a predator who specialized in hunting ghosts. Back in the intensive care unit, I closed the telecommunications portal and opened a blank note application on my phone. I began typing the numbers, letting the stark reality of the arithmetic guide my next move. The wire transfer totaled $318,000. The wine debt totaled $15,000. Even if they paid off the vintage Bordeaux to keep my father out of civil court, that left $303,000 unaccounted for. A massive sum of phantom capital floating through the banking system. I thought back to the crystal vase resting on my tray table, to the pale ghost orchids my mother had purchased to decorate my trauma. I remembered the address on the floral envelope. Wilmington, Delaware. Declan was running out of investor cash. He needed an untraceable injection of liquidity to keep his startup afloat, and he used my father's pathetic vanity as the ultimate distraction. My mother executed the physical forgery, but Declan built the receiving architecture. He utilized the exact blueprint I taught him at a steakhouse years ago. He registered an anonymous entity in a tax haven to catch the stolen money. The pieces snapped together, forming a lethal picture. The destination account belonged to Apex Holding Solutions. I did not need Gregory to hand me the bank ledger anymore. I had the name of the shell company, and I knew the state where it was incubated. Delaware prides itself on corporate secrecy, offering registered agents who hide the true owners of an LLC behind layers of administrative red tape. But secrecy is a product you have to pay for, and my brother was notoriously sloppy with his administrative overhead. He liked the illusion of brilliance, but he despised the tedious details of actual execution. If Declan filed the incorporation papers for Apex Holding Solutions himself to save money on attorney fees, he would have left a fingerprint on the state registry. I adjusted my grip on the phone, ignoring the burning sensation radiating down my spine. The hunt was no longer about a forged signature or a corrupt notary. It was about dismantling a corporate fraud from the inside out. I prepared to log into the Delaware Division of Corporations database. I was going to find the trapdoor. I navigated away from the telecommunications portal and opened a new browser tab. The hospital wireless network dragged, taking several long seconds to load the official government website for the Delaware Division of Corporations. My left thumb ached from the continuous scrolling, but the physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the cold adrenaline pumping through my chest. Delaware offers a public search function for registered business entities. It is designed to be intentionally vague, providing only the bare minimum of corporate data to satisfy federal transparency laws while keeping the actual asset holders cloaked in administrative shadows. I typed Apex Holding Solutions into the search bar and tapped the query button. The database spun, querying decades of corporate filings. A single result populated on the screen. Apex Holding Solutions was registered as a domestic limited liability company. The formation date was listed as just 4 days prior. The entity had been incubated and birthed while I was lying in a medically induced coma. I tapped the link to view the registered agent information. Delaware law requires every corporation to maintain a physical address within the state to receive legal correspondence. The address listed for Apex Holding Solutions was a suite number located in a commercial office park in Wilmington. It was a known mail drop, a virtual office front where thousands of ghost companies received their forwarding mail. I looked up from my glowing phone screen. My eyes locked onto the crystal vase resting on the rolling tray table. The ghost orchids seemed to mock me under the harsh fluorescent lighting. I reached over and picked up the heavy cardstock envelope that had accompanied the floral delivery. Earlier, I assumed my mother ordered the flowers from an exclusive East Coast botanical boutique, but I was looking at the printed receipt wrong. The boutique itself was located in downtown Chicago. The Wilmington address printed at the bottom of the invoice was not the shipping origin. It was the billing address for the credit card used to purchase the arrangement. I placed the envelope next to my phone and compared the two strings of text. The street number, the commercial suite, and the specific zip code on the floral receipt were an identical match to the registered agent address for Apex Holding Solutions. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Patricia Onyx was not a desperate, manipulated housewife who forged a signature out of blind panic to save her husband. She had access to the corporate credit card linked to the offshore shell company. She was an active, authorized user on the very account holding my stolen life savings. My mother had driven to a high-end florist in the Loop, selected an arrangement of rare orchids, and paid for them using the exact capital she had just drained from my emergency fund. She funded her performance of maternal grief using my own money. The psychological cruelty was staggering. Patricia wanted the aesthetic of the concerned wealthy mother visiting her traumatized daughter, and she wanted me to finance the illusion. The forged power of attorney was not a mistake born of fear. It was a calculated extraction. But my brother remained the architect. Patricia lacked the technical proficiency to establish a Delaware holding company. Declan built the vault, and he handed our mother the debit card. I needed physical proof of his involvement. I clicked the portal link to request a digital scan of the original articles of organization for the holding company. The state required a small processing fee to view the actual PDF document. I could not use my frozen bank accounts, so I typed in the credentials for a secondary corporate card issued by my accounting firm. The transaction cleared. The digital document loaded on my screen. It was a standard 2-page formation template, filled out and submitted electronically. I zoomed in on the liability limitation clause, scanning the boilerplate legal jargon. My eyes caught a glaring irregularity in the 4th paragraph. The word fiduciary was spelled incorrectly. It was typed as fiduciary, missing the letter I in the middle of the word. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped my dry throat. Years ago, during that humid dinner at the steakhouse, I had drawn the corporate structure on a linen napkin for a young, arrogant Declan. I had specifically warned him about that exact legal term. I told him that spelling fiduciary incorrectly on state and corporation documents was a rookie mistake that could void the liability protections in certain strict jurisdictions. Declan had rolled his eyes, telling me I focused too much on the tedious details. He was so arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchable brilliance, that he rushed the digital paperwork and committed the exact typographical error I had warned him about. It was the equivalent of leaving a fingerprint at a crime scene. The final piece of the forensic puzzle locked into place. $318,000 did not go to a phantom bookie. It did not go toward a vintage wine debt. Declan was the founder of a venture capital tech startup that was rapidly burning through its seed funding. His investors were demanding progress, his server migration was costing a fortune, and his corporate accounts were bleeding dry. He needed an untraceable cash injection to save his failing company from bankruptcy, and he found that liquidity sitting in my high-yield savings account. My family had sacrificed my financial future to artificially inflate my brother's failing tech empire. 20 miles away, the man they used as their perfect scapegoat sat alone in a dimly lit suburban bar. Richard Onyx stared at the condensation sliding down the side of his domestic beer glass. The Oakbrook Country Club Lounge was usually a place of loud, performative networking, but on a Tuesday evening, the mahogany room was quiet. The scent of stale gin and lemon polish hung in the air. Richard did not belong in the leather corner booth. He was a man out of time, a former logistics manager trying to maintain the posture of a wealthy executive on an empty wallet. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He opened his text thread with Vincenzo Rossi. The final message from the wine broker read simply, "Account settled in full. Thank you for your business." Richard exhaled a long, shaky breath, letting his shoulders slump. The crushing weight of the $15,000 invoice had been lifted. He felt a deep, humiliating sense of relief, followed immediately by a wave of paternal guilt. Earlier that week, when the threats from the broker escalated, Richard had confessed his financial failure to his wife and son. He sat in his pristine Naperville kitchen and wept, admitting he could not afford the vintage Bordeaux he had ordered to impress the club membership committee. Declan had placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Declan had looked him in the eye and told him not to worry. His golden son promised to quietly borrow $15,000 from a private venture capital friend to make the wine debt disappear. Declan assured him that Carson would never have to know, that the family reputation would remain entirely intact. Richard believed the lie. He sat in the quiet bar nursing his cheap beer, convinced his son was a savior and his wife was a silent, supportive partner. He thought his vanity had cost the family a minor inconvenience. He had absolutely no idea his daughter was currently lying in a hospital trauma unit, robbed of a fortune. He did not know his wife had forged a federal document, or that his son was laundering stolen capital through a Delaware tax haven. Richard thought he was the architect of the family crisis, a small burden they had generously carried. He was merely the bait. When the truth finally reached him, the illusion of his perfect family would not just crack, it would shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. And I intended to be the one holding the hammer. By Friday morning, my medical team determined I was stable enough to be moved from the intensive care unit to a step-down recovery floor. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was gone, replaced by the dull ache of bruised ribs and the rigid confinement of my cervical collar. The new room featured a larger window filtering the pale Chicago sunlight across the linoleum, but the financial siege remained in full effect. My personal bank accounts were still locked behind Gregory and his bureaucratic firewall. I was still broke on paper, but I now knew exactly where the stolen capital had landed. The heavy door swung open, admitting a sudden gust of heavy floral perfume and the sharp click of designer heels. Victoria, my brother's wife, stepped into the room. She held a metallic leather handbag tightly against her waist, her gaze sweeping over the sterile medical equipment with thinly veiled distaste. Victoria tolerated the hospital environment the same way she tolerated me, out of sheer social obligation. Victoria was a woman who curated her life for an audience that did not actually care. She possessed a relentless obsession with interior design and suburban social climbing, viewing her marriage to Declan as a ticket into the elite echelons of Chicago wealth. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and obsessing over custom drapery, blissfully insulated from the gritty mechanics of how her husband actually funded their lifestyle. She did not marry a venture capitalist because she loved technology. She married him for the aesthetic of success. She pulled a vinyl guest chair closer to the bed, being careful not to let her tailored wool coat touch the hospital blankets. "Carson," she sighed, offering a tight, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "You look terrible. I would have come sooner, but the traffic on Interstate 90 was a nightmare, and my schedule has been incredibly demanding this week." Her opening statement established the baseline. A near-fatal car crash was secondary to her transit inconvenience. "I appreciate you finding the time," I replied, keeping my voice smooth and devoid of sarcasm. My throat still burned with every syllable, but I refused to show her any weakness. Victoria crossed her legs, adjusting the heavy diamond ring on her left hand so it caught the ambient light. "It has just been a whirlwind at the house," she continued, leaning forward slightly as if sharing a corporate secret. "Declan has been working such insane hours since the new funding round closed. He is carrying so much stress right now." I kept my facial muscles perfectly still. "A new funding round. Declan told you he secured new capital?" I asked, tilting my head a fraction of an inch against the brace. "Oh, he pulled off a miracle," Victoria beamed, her posture straightening with pure pride. "A silent angel investor out of Silicon Valley. They wired the advance on Tuesday afternoon. It was the exact liquidity injection his tech platform needed to scale. Honestly, Carson, you should see the relief on his face. He is finally getting the recognition his brilliance deserves." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. Tuesday afternoon was the exact window when my mother forged the power of attorney and drained my savings. Declan had not just deceived the bank and manipulated his parents. He had looked his own wife in the eye and spun my stolen life savings into a fictional Silicon Valley angel investment. He fed her ego, knowing she would never demand to see the actual underwriting documents as long as the money cleared. Victoria was completely oblivious to the mechanics of the fraud. She was floating on a cloud of fabricated superiority, thrilled to finally have the financial upper hand over the sister-in-law who always scrutinized their balance sheets. I let her bask in the delusion. "That is impressive," I murmured, forcing a tone of genuine admiration. "Securing liquid capital in this economic climate requires a flawless pitch. You both must be celebrating." Victoria waved her hand dismissively, though her smile widened. "We barely have time to celebrate. The logistics are exhausting. We are closing on the Lake Geneva property next Thursday, and the decorators are already breathing down my neck for the final dimensions." Lake Geneva, the enclave for affluent Chicago executives seeking waterfront escapes. My brother was not using the stolen capital to salvage his failing software company. He was diverting the funds to purchase luxury real estate, securing a tangible asset under his new Delaware holding company to hide the cash from his angry tech investors. "That is a major acquisition," I noted, carefully threading the needle of the conversation. Mortgages on vacation homes are notoriously slow right now. The underwriting process usually takes months. Victoria let out a short, musical laugh, dripping with condescension. We are not dealing with a mortgage, Carson. The seller demanded a fast transition, and Declan wanted to secure the property before the summer season. We are closing a $1.2 million all-cash escrow. The funds are already sitting in the holding account. It is just a matter of signing the final deed. The mathematical pieces snapped into perfect alignment inside my head. $318,000 was not $1.2 million, but it was exactly the required 25% cash injection needed to satisfy the earnest money requirements and close the gap on a structured corporate purchase. Declan was using my savings as the foundational block for his real estate laundering scheme. All cash, I repeated, letting my eyes widen slightly to feed her vanity. That requires an exceptional title company to process the escrow that quickly. Victoria preened, eager to demonstrate her insider knowledge of high-end real estate transactions. Lakeshore Title and Escrow. They are the premier firm up in Wisconsin. Their managing partner is handling the file personally. We just show up next Thursday morning, sign the transfer documents, and they hand us the keys to the boathouse. She had just handed me the vault combination. I knew the name of the Delaware Shell Company. I knew the name of the title firm. I knew the exact date the funds were scheduled to disperse. The stolen money was not floating untethered in the banking system. It was sitting vulnerable and stationary in a localized escrow account, waiting for a final signature. I hope you get some rest, Carson, Victoria said, glancing at the gold watch on her wrist. I really need to run. I have a consultation with a landscape architect at 2 o'clock. We want to tear out the existing hedges before Memorial Day. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her wool coat. She leaned over and offered a brief, airless kiss near my cheek, a gesture entirely for her own benefit. Take care of yourself, she whispered, and do not worry about your father. Declan has everything under control. I watched her walk toward the heavy door, adjusting the strap of her metallic handbag as she stepped out into the corridor. She walked away feeling victorious, believing she had just solidified her status at the top of the family hierarchy. She had no idea she was sleeping next to a felon, or that the mansion she was decorating in her head was built on a foundation of federal wire fraud. As soon as the door clicked shut, I reached for my phone. The red banking banner still blocked my personal finances, but my corporate email client was hosted on an independent server managed by my accounting firm. Gregory and his localized freeze could not touch my professional communication channels. I drafted a new message to Marcus, the senior corporate litigation attorney who frequently partnered with my auditing team on asset recovery cases. Marcus was ruthless efficient and owed me a significant professional favor after I traced a hidden offshore account during his last high-profile divorce settlement. I typed the instructions using my left thumb, my focus narrowing to the glowing screen. I provided the name of my brother. I provided the name of the Delaware Shell Company, Apex Holding Solutions. I listed Lakeshore Title and Escrow, and I flagged the closing date set for next Thursday. I need you to draft a quiet title search on the target property immediately, I wrote. Prepare a lis pendens to file with the county clerk in Wisconsin. The buyer is utilizing stolen funds transferred across state lines. Draft an emergency injunction to freeze the escrow account based on suspected wire fraud. Do not serve the notice to the title company yet. Just arm the weapon and wait for my signal. I hit send. The message vanished into the encrypted server. The trap was officially set. The money was pinned down. I had outmaneuvered the bank manager, isolated the fake angel investor narrative, and located the physical cash. But Declan was a man who lived in a state of constant digital paranoia. He monitored his corporate infrastructure obsessively, terrified that his legitimate investors would discover his fraudulent ledger. The moment Marcus pinged the title company's registry to initiate the quiet title search, an automated digital ripple would travel back to the buyer of record. My brother was about to receive a notification that a corporate litigator was looking at his private real estate transaction. The ghost was about to realize it was being hunted, and a hunted man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous variable on the board. The encrypted reply from Marcus arrived less than an hour after Victoria walked out of my recovery room. My attorney did not waste time with pleasantries or padded assurances. He operated with the lethal efficiency of a corporate shark who smelled blood in the water. I opened the secure email client on my phone, ignoring the dull, persistent throb in my fractured collarbone. The message contained a single PDF attachment and 3 lines of text. He confirmed the quiet title search on the Lake Geneva property was underway. But Marcus had taken the initiative to escalate the timeline. Recognizing the vulnerability of the stolen capital sitting in the Wisconsin escrow account he had drafted, and filed an emergency ex parte motion in Cook County Court. An ex parte motion is a specific legal maneuver designed for corporate warfare. It allows an attorney to petition a judge for a subpoena without notifying the opposing party. The target gets no warning. They get no opportunity to scrub their servers or shred their documents. The judge reviewed my surgical timestamps, matched them against the physical wire transfer receipt, and signed the order immediately. A federal subpoena had just slammed into Gregory's desk at Illinois Heritage Bank, compelling the immediate release of all IP routing logs, dual-factor authentication records, and digital communications related to the $318,000 transfer. Gregory was a man who prioritized his own survival above all else. Faced with a direct order from a Cook County judge and the looming threat of an obstruction charge, his loyalty to my father and his secret equity stake in my brother's company evaporated. He complied. He handed over the raw server data. Marcus forwarded the encrypted packet directly to my device. I was physically confined to a hospital bed wearing a rigid cervical collar, but in the digital space, I was untethered. I logged into my accounting firm's remote mainframe using the heavy processing power of our corporate servers to parse the raw data packet on my phone screen. The lines of code and time-stamped IP addresses cascaded in neat, structured rows. The digital footprint told a story of pure panic. The bank logs showed that Gregory notified Declan the moment the subpoena was executed. A normal, innocent client would have called an attorney to understand the inquiry. My brother chose a different path. The server data captured a frantic, sloppy attempt to construct a retroactive alibi. I watched the live metadata updates as Declan began flooding Gregory's secure bank portal with new attachments. He was trying to backdate emails, attempting to create a fictional correspondence history that framed the stolen money as a legitimate, pre-approved corporate loan. He uploaded a PDF of a federal promissory note detailing a structured repayment plan between myself and Apex Holding Solutions. The arrogance was staggering, but his execution was entirely amateur. You cannot alter a digital timeline without leaving a temporal shadow. Every file created on a modern operating system contains embedded metadata tracking the exact second of its inception. Declan changed the visible text on the document to reflect a date from last month, but the underlying hash value proved the file was generated 20 minutes ago. By attempting to cover his tracks across state lines, Declan had just committed a secondary layer of federal wire fraud. He was handing me the nails for his own coffin. I continued filtering the authentication logs, my eyes scanning the hexadecimal strings. I was looking for the specific digital handshake that authorized the final release of the funds. A physical signature on a forged power of attorney initiated the process, but the bank required a secondary verification code sent to a mobile device to release a 6-figure sum. I found the entry. Tuesday at 2:14 in the afternoon. The log detailed the exact IP address of the device that received and verified the authentication code. It was an Apple iPad operating on a public wireless network. I copied the numerical IP string and pasted it into a geolocation mapping tool. I needed to know exactly where my mother and brother were sitting when they finalized the theft of my life savings. My mother had spun a tragic narrative. She claimed they were huddled in the hospital waiting room weeping over my prognosis, driven to desperate measures by the terrifying threats of a violent bookie. The mapping software digested the IP address. The loading icon spun for 3 seconds before dropping a red digital pin onto a map of downtown Chicago. The location was not Northwestern Memorial Hospital. It was not a tense, sterile waiting room. The coordinates locked onto an artisanal coffee roastery in the Gold Coast neighborhood, an upscale cafe known for single-origin espresso and leather seating. It was located 3 blocks from Declan's venture capital firm. The air in my hospital room suddenly felt very thin. I stared at the red pin on the screen, the clinical reality of the data washing over me. At 2:14 on Tuesday afternoon, paramedics were wheeling my crushed body through the trauma bay doors. Surgeons were cutting through my sternum to stop internal bleeding. I was fighting for my next breath under the harsh lights of an operating table. While my chest was being cut open, my mother and my brother were sitting in a luxury coffee shop. They were sipping flat whites, utilizing the quiet ambiance to intercept my dual-factor authentication texts and systematically drain my financial portfolio. There was no panic. There was no emergency maternal sacrifice. They did not wait to see if I would survive the surgery. They saw my catastrophic car accident not as a family tragedy, but as a narrow, convenient logistical window to execute a heist. They capitalized on my presumed death to fund a real estate acquisition in Lake Geneva. The undeniable proof of their premeditation dropped over me like a heavy iron shroud. Up until this exact second, a small, fragile part of my psychology had still viewed them as my family. I had categorized them as selfish, narcissistic, and profoundly flawed. But I still operated under the assumption that some twisted version of familial love existed beneath the greed. That assumption died in the cold light of the geolocation data. The tether snapped. The societal obligation to forgive, the ingrained instinct to protect my bloodline, the persistent voice whispering that family was sacred. It all vanished. The quiet, sturdy daughter they had relied upon to absorb their failures was gone. I did not want restitution anymore. I did not just want my $318,000 returned. I wanted to dismantle their lives down to the studs. I wanted to watch the structural collapse of everything they valued. I transitioned in that quiet recovery room from a victim seeking justice into a predator seeking absolute ruin. But a forensic ledger and a geographic pin were only half of the equation. Declan was wealthy enough to hire aggressive defense attorneys. He would argue the IP address was spoofed. He would claim the iPad was stolen. My mother would take the stand, weaponize her tears, and swear she acted under extreme emotional duress. A skilled litigator could drag a civil fraud case through the courts for years, draining my recovered capital in endless legal fees. To bypass the legal friction, I needed something irrefutable. I needed an uncoerced, recorded admission of guilt. I needed them to speak the exact mechanics of their conspiracy out loud, detailing the shell company, the forged signature, and the SIM card cloning in their own voices. They would never say those words to me. They would never confess in a room where I was present. They felt too insulated, too secure in the belief that I was physically incapacitated and legally paralyzed. To strike the fatal blow, I had to breach their inner sanctum. I needed a Trojan horse. I needed someone they trusted implicitly, someone they viewed as weak and complicit, to walk into their pristine suburban fortress and document the rot from the inside. I closed the mapping application and opened my contact list. I scrolled past Marcus, past my corporate auditing team, and stopped on a number I had not dialed in weeks. I looked at the name glowing on the glass. Richard Onyx. My father believed his pathetic vanity over a $15,000 wine invoice was the catalyst for this entire disaster. He was drowning in guilt, unaware that his favorite son had used him as a convenient scapegoat. If I showed him the true scope of the betrayal, if I shattered his illusion of the perfect family, his crushing guilt could be weaponized. I pressed the call button. It was time to recruit my inside man. Richard Onyx stepped into my hospital room just as the afternoon sun dipped below the neighboring parking garage, casting long gray shadows across the linoleum floor. The man who entered was unrecognizable. The father I knew usually strutted through the Oakbrook Country Club, wearing tailored linen and an unearned smirk, projecting an aura of generational wealth he did not actually possess. In his place stood a hollowed-out shell of a patriarch. His posture slumped forward, dragging his shoulders toward the ground. His eyes were rimmed with red, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. His expensive dress shirt was wrinkled, and his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the plastic visitor chair. He carried the heavy burden of a man who believed his petty sins had destroyed his own daughter. He sank into the chair and buried his face in his palms. The silence in the room stretched broken only by the steady beep of my heart monitor. "Carson," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his performance, "I am so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." I kept my gaze fixed on the ceiling tiles, refusing to offer him the immediate absolution he was seeking. "Tell me about the debt," I instructed, keeping my tone entirely clinical. Richard lifted his head, his eyes brimming with tears. He looked like a cornered animal pleading for mercy. He confessed everything. He told me about the country club membership committee, the pressure to maintain appearances, and the imported French Bordeaux he ordered from Vincenzo Rossi to impress his wealthy peers. He admitted the broker threatened to file a civil lawsuit over the unpaid $15,000 invoice. "Your mother panicked," Richard sobbed, leaning closer to the bed rail. "When the threats started, we did not know what to do. The broker was talking about sending debt collectors to the house. Patricia was terrified the scandal would ruin us. When the hospital called about your accident, she saw your emergency accounts and made a desperate choice. She thought she was saving our family. She thought we could pay you back before you even woke up." He reached out, attempting to grasp my uninjured hand. "Please forgive me. This is my fault. My vanity cost you your savings." I pulled my hand back, letting his fingers grasp empty air. My voice dropped to a temperature that froze the remaining air in the room. "Stop talking, Dad." Richard blinked, stunned by the coldness of the command. The tears pooled in his eyes, but he snapped his mouth shut. I reached for the laptop resting on my tray table. Marcus, my corporate attorney, had sent the device via a bonded courier earlier that morning, loaded with the encrypted files from the bank subpoena and the quiet title search. I flipped the screen open and turned the monitor so it faced my father. "You owe a wine broker $15,000, I said, pointing to the glowing screen. "Look at the digital receipt from Illinois Heritage Bank. Read the wire transfer amount out loud." Richard squinted at the document. $318,000, he read, his voice wavering with confusion. "Now look at the destination account," I commanded, clicking to the next document. "That is the corporate registration for Apex Holding Solutions. It is a shell company located in a Delaware tax haven. Look at the authorized signature at the bottom of the state filing." Richard leaned closer to the screen. His breath hitched. It was Declan's signature. I clicked to the third file, bringing up the escrow documentation from Lakeshore Title and Escrow. "I want you to read the property description and the required cash deposit," I said. My father stared at the screen for a long time. The numbers began to click together inside his mind, dismantling his reality piece by piece. He read the details of the luxury waterfront property in Lake Geneva. He saw the exact demand for a $318,000 cash injection to close the sale. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ash gray. The tears dried up, instantly replaced by a hollow, terrifying shock. "They did not take your money to pay off the wine broker," Richard whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. "No, they did not," I confirmed, delivering the final, crushing blow. "You are not the villain of this story. You are the bait." Declan is burning through his venture capital funding. He needed cash to secure his vacation mansion before his investors realized his company was failing. He used your pathetic vanity over a wine invoice as the perfect smokescreen. Patricia forged my name, and Declan built the corporate vault to catch the money. I opened the final document on the laptop displaying the geolocation data from the IP routing logs. While I was bleeding out on an operating table, your wife and your golden son were sitting in a luxury coffee shop in the Gold Coast. They drank espresso and intercepted the bank's security codes. They executed the heist, while they waited to see if my heart would stop beating. The psychological devastation was absolute. Richard sat paralyzed in the vinyl chair, staring at the irrefutable forensic evidence of his own irrelevance. He realized his wife and his favorite son viewed him as entirely disposable. They had weaponized his weakness, fed his guilt, and let him shoulder the blame for a felony they orchestrated for their own greed. The illusion of his perfect, loyal family shattered into dust right in front of my eyes. Richard buried his face in his hands again, but this time he did not weep. He let out a low, guttural sound, the noise of a man whose entire foundation had just collapsed. I did not offer comfort. I needed his anger. I needed the raw, fresh wound of his betrayal to fuel the next phase of my strategy. "Look at me," I ordered. Richard raised his head. His eyes were hard, the pathetic aura of the disgraced patriarch replaced by a dark, simmering fury. "I am going to dismantle Declan's life," I told him, speaking with slow, deliberate precision. "I am going to freeze his assets, destroy his corporate reputation, and force his investors to liquidate his portfolio. I am going to leave him with nothing. But to ensure he goes to federal prison, I need an uncoerced confession. I need them to speak the details of the conspiracy out loud." I reached under my hospital pillow and pulled out a small, sleek, digital audio recorder. Marcus had included the device in the courier package. I placed the black metal rectangle onto the tray table, sliding it toward my father. "They host a family dinner every Sunday evening in Naperville," I said. "You are going to attend tomorrow night. You are going to sit at the head of the table, eat the roast your wife prepares, and act as though nothing has changed. You will tell them the wine broker is still threatening you. You will play the terrified, guilty father." Richard stared at the small recording device. "You will ask Declan how the bank transfer worked," I continued, outlining the tactical script. "You will ask Patricia who stamped the notary seal. You will feign ignorance, begging them to explain how they managed to save you. Their arrogance will not allow them to stay quiet. They will brag about their brilliance. They will detail the shell company, the forged signature, and the cloned SIM card on tape." Richard slowly reached out and closed his fingers around the metal recorder. He squeezed the device so hard his knuckles turned white. He did not hesitate. He did not plead for his wife or his son. The betrayal had burned away his loyalty. "I will get it," Richard said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Every word." He stood up, slipping the device into the interior pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket. He looked at me one last time, a silent acknowledgement of the war we were about to wage, before turning and walking out of the hospital room. The trap was officially set. I had an inside informant carrying a wire into the heart of the enemy camp. But as I watched the heavy door click shut, my analytical mind identified the remaining structural flaw in my plan. An audio recording is a powerful weapon, but skilled defense attorneys routinely challenge covert tapes in court. They argue the context was manipulated, or they claim the conversation was a misunderstood joke. If Declan and Patricia possessed a legally binding notarized power of attorney, the courts and the banking institutions would still defer to the physical paper trail. The state of Illinois recognizes a licensed notary seal as the ultimate truth. As long as that document remained unchallenged, their legal shield held strong. Before Richard could trigger the audio trap on Sunday night, I needed to systematically destroy the foundation of their defense. I needed to isolate the corrupt paralegal who stamped the forged paperwork. I had to find Sarah, corner her in a room she could not escape, and force a written confession that would render the power of attorney entirely void. I pulled my phone from the tray table and opened a direct message to Marcus. It was time to hunt the notary. I could not physically leave my recovery bed to confront the woman who rubber-stamped my financial destruction. Corporate warfare, however, is rarely fought with physical presence. It is fought through leverage, proxies, and overwhelming documentation. I had isolated the geographic location of the corrupt paralegal, and I dispatched my attorney to execute the ambush on my behalf. Marcus called me from his vehicle, outlining his approach as he pulled into the parking lot. Sarah was a mid-level legal assistant working at a generic strip mall law firm off Route 59 in Naperville. She spent her days filing routine probate paperwork and notarizing real estate deeds for local suburbanites. She was a woman who craved luxury but lacked the ambition to earn it, making her the perfect target for a quick bribe. My brother likely offered her a few $1,000s in cash to stamp a single piece of paper, assuring her it was merely an administrative shortcut for a family emergency. She believed the lie because she wanted the cash, assuming no one would ever audit a transaction between a frantic mother and an incapacitated daughter. Marcus located her during her lunch hour. According to his detailed report, she was sitting in a vinyl booth at a faded diner adjacent to her office building. She was eating a turkey sandwich and scrolling through social media, surrounded by the smell of fried grease and the clatter of cheap silverware. Marcus did not introduce himself. He simply slid into the booth across from her. His tailored charcoal suit provided a stark contrast to the sticky laminate table. He placed a thick manila folder next to her plate and waited for her to look up. Sarah blinked, startled by the sudden intrusion. She opened her mouth to object, but Marcus raised a single hand, demanding total silence. He opened the folder and slid the first piece of paper across the table. It was a high-resolution copy of the forged power of attorney. Her official state notary seal was pressed firmly into the bottom right corner, certifying that I had personally appeared before her and signed the document on Tuesday afternoon. Sarah swallowed hard. Her gaze darted toward the diner exit. She recognized the paperwork immediately, and the color began to drain from her cheeks. Marcus kept his voice low and devoid of any empathy. He slid the second document over the laminate surface. It was my official surgical chart from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He tapped his index finger against the timestamp logged by the anesthesiologist. This document proves my client was under general anesthesia with her chest cavity open at the exact minute you swore she was standing in a bank lobby, Marcus informed her. You certified a ghost. Sarah dropped her sandwich. Her hands began to shake with a severe tremor. She bumped her ceramic mug, spilling dark coffee across the table and onto her blouse, but she did not even reach for a napkin. The reality of her situation was crashing through her wall of denial. She was staring at undeniable evidence of a federal crime, and the man sitting across from her held the execution order. Marcus delivered the final blow. He slid a third document forward. It was a draft of a federal complaint listing Sarah as a co-conspirator in a wire fraud scheme totaling $318,000. She scrambled for her purse, her trembling fingers wrapping around her mobile phone. She was reacting on pure instinct, desperate to call Declan, seeking reassurance from the man who dragged her into this nightmare. She needed him to fix it. Call him Marcus, offered, leaning back against the vinyl booth. But before you dial, you should try checking your personal checking account balance. Sarah froze her thumb hovering over the screen. I filed a preliminary injunction in Cook County Court this morning, Marcus explained, his tone cold and precise. A judge reviewed your notary seal against the surgical timeline and froze every financial account tied to your Social Security number. You have no funds. You cannot hire a defense attorney. You cannot pay your rent. If you call Declan Onyx, you become an active participant in an ongoing criminal cover-up, and I will hand this federal complaint to the district attorney by 3 o'clock today. The trap was flawless. She had no warning system and no escape route. Marcus had stripped away her resources before she even realized she was under attack. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her mascara and tracking down her face. She began to hyperventilate in the middle of the crowded diner, realizing her entire life was about to be obliterated over a single forged signature. Marcus withdrew a final piece of paper from the manila folder. It was a sworn affidavit. The text explicitly detailed how Patricia Onyx and Declan Onyx bribed her to authenticate a document without the signatory present. You have one expiring lifeline, Marcus told her, placing a pen on top of the affidavit. Sign this confession, turn state's witness against the Onyx family, and I will ask the judge to lift the freeze on your accounts. You might lose your notary license, but you will not spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. You have 30 seconds to decide." Sarah did not even read the fine print. She grabbed the pen, her hand shaking so badly she could barely form the letters of her own name. She wept, openly sobbing, as she signed away my family's only legal shield. Marcus retrieved the signed affidavit, placed it carefully into his briefcase, and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving her crying over a puddle of spilled coffee. 20 minutes later, a secure digital scan of the confession arrived in my inbox. I stared at the signature on my glowing phone screen. The legal armor protecting Declan and Patricia had just evaporated. They were walking around their pristine suburban bubble, blissfully unaware that their foundational alibi was dead. They thought the notary seal made them bulletproof. They did not know the woman who provided that seal had just handed me the ammunition to destroy them. That afternoon, the attending physician finally cleared my discharge paperwork. My physical injuries were far from healed, but I no longer required intensive monitoring. A nurse unhooked my intravenous lines and helped me navigate into my clothes. The rigid cervical collar remained locked around my neck, and my bruised ribs protested with every shallow breath. To assist with my mobility, the physical therapy department issued a sleek carbon fiber cane. It was lightweight, engineered for maximum load bearing, and devoid of any medical bulk. I gripped the synthetic handle, leaning my weight onto the dark composite material. My biological bones were fractured and fragile, but the synthetic support felt unbreakable. It was a fitting metaphor for the war I was fighting. I bypassed the hospital wheelchair protocol, insisting on walking myself out of the ward. Every step sent a jolt of pain up my spine, but the physical discomfort focused my mind. I needed the pain. It was a constant, sharp reminder of the vulnerability they tried to exploit. The automatic glass doors of the hospital lobby parted, and I stepped out into the crisp, biting Chicago air. The wind whipped off Lake Michigan, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and cold concrete. I stood on the pavement, watching the city traffic flow past, calculating my next trajectory. The affidavit neutralized the family's defense. The audio recorder hidden inside my father's suit jacket was poised to capture their confession on Sunday night. The physical cash was trapped in a Wisconsin escrow account, waiting for the title search to spring the lock. But my personal checking and savings accounts were still locked behind a localized bank freeze. I gripped the carbon fiber cane, my knuckles turning white. Before I dropped a hammer on my mother and brother, I had to sever their institutional lifeline. Gregory, the affluent branch manager, thought he could stonewall me into submission to protect his secret equity stake in Declan's tech startup. He thought the bureaucratic firewall would keep him safe. Gregory was about to learn that protecting a fraud is just as lethal as committing one. I hailed a passing taxi, giving the driver the address of the Illinois Heritage Bank corporate headquarters. The notary was broken, and now it was time to introduce the branch manager to the consequences of his arrogance. The taxi smelled of stale pine air freshener and worn leather. I sat in the back seat, the carbon fiber cane resting across my knees. Every pothole on the Chicago streets sent a sharp jolt of pain through my fractured collarbone, but I kept my focus locked on the laptop screen balanced on my lap. The notary was neutralized, but Gregory remained a formidable obstacle. His decision to freeze my operational accounts was highly irregular. A standard risk management protocol dictates freezing the destination account, not paralyzing the victim. Gregory acted with desperation, shielding the outflow of capital. I opened a proprietary financial database, a tool licensed exclusively to elite forensic accounting firms. Delaware tax havens are designed to obscure ownership, but true anonymity is a myth. Money always leaves a shadow. I bypassed the standard public registry and ran a deep relational query on Apex Holding Solutions. I cross-referenced the corporate identification number against historical tax filings, looking for the initial capitalization structure. The database chewed through the algorithms. It cross-referenced Declan's venture capital firm with the newly minted shell company. The query returned a capitalization table revealing the hidden architecture of my brother's failing tech empire. Declan held 85% of the voting shares. The remaining 15% belonged to a silent equity partner holding preferred stock. I highlighted the partner's legal entity, a trust, registered under a generic alphanumeric sequence. I ran that sequence through a property tax database, tracing the mailing address tied to the trust. The address resolved to a multi-million-dollar estate in the affluent suburb of Oakbrook. I checked the deed. The property belonged to Gregory. The revelation shifted the entire landscape of the war. This was no longer just a family betrayal. It was an institutional conspiracy. Gregory was not a cautious branch manager protecting his bank from liability. He was a compromised investor drowning in my brother's sinking ship. Years ago, Gregory likely injected his own personal wealth into Declan's tech startup, seduced by the promise of exponential Silicon Valley returns. But the platform was failing. The burn rate was unsustainable, and the legitimate venture capitalists were preparing to pull their funding. If the startup filed for bankruptcy, Gregory would lose his early-stage investment. He needed a miracle to artificially inflate the company valuation before the final investor review. My brother provided the solution, offering up my high-yield savings account as the sacrificial lamb. Declan built the Delaware Shell Company, Patricia forged the signature, and Gregory authorized the wire transfer from the inside. He bypassed the dual-factor authentication warnings and pushed the money through to save his own equity. When I woke up and challenged the transfer, he froze my remaining funds to starve my legal response, buying them time to finalize the Lake Geneva real estate purchase and clean the ledger. The taxi pulled to a stop at a red light. The towering glass facade of Illinois Heritage Bank loomed 3 blocks away. I did not instruct the driver to proceed to the corporate lobby. Confronting Gregory in person would allow him to call security and hide behind corporate protocol. I needed to corner him in his own office using his own greed. I opened a blank word processing document and began typing. I did not draft a polite request for an account review. I drafted a formal complaint addressed directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I outlined the exact mechanism of the fraud with surgical precision. I detailed how a senior branch manager leveraged his institutional authority to bypass security protocols, authorizing a fraudulent 6-figure wire transfer to benefit a commercial entity in which he held a 15% silent equity stake. I cited the specific federal banking statutes he violated. I attached the notary confession proving the physical paperwork was forged. I attached the IP routing logs proving the digital authentication was intercepted at a coffee shop. I attached the capitalization table proving his financial motive. The document was a lethal weapon. If the federal regulators received that file, Gregory would not just lose his job. He would face federal indictment for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The government would seize his Oakbrook estate, revoke his banking license, and freeze his retirement accounts. I exported the document as a secure digital file. I sent a copy to Marcus, instructing him to print the dossier and dispatch it via a priority courier to the bank branch addressed directly to Gregory's personal desk. Now I just had to wait for the bomb to detonate. I paid the taxi fare and stepped out onto the sidewalk, leaning heavily on my synthetic cane. I found a quiet bench across the street from the bank plaza, shielding myself from the biting wind. The afternoon traffic flowed past, ignorant of the financial execution unfolding inside the glass tower. 15 minutes later, a bicycle courier wearing a bright yellow jacket entered the revolving doors of the bank. I watched the digital clock on my phone screen. 10 minutes passed. The courier emerged his delivery bag, slightly lighter. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my palm. The caller identification displayed the main switchboard number for Illinois Heritage Bank. I pressed accept, bringing the device to my ear. I did not speak. Carson Gregory gasped, his voice thin and hollow. The smooth, patronizing paternal tone was entirely gone. He sounded like a man who had just stepped off a ledge, realizing too late he forgot his parachute. He was breathing in rapid, shallow bursts. I am reviewing a very interesting capitalization table, Gregory, I said, keeping my voice level and unhurried. 15% preferred equity in a failing tech platform. That is a substantial personal risk. I imagine the upcoming venture capital review had you sweating. It must have felt like a stroke of genius when Declan offered to launder my savings to inflate the balance sheet. Please, Gregory, stammered the words slipping out as a desperate plea. You cannot send this file to the federal regulators. It will ruin me. I was misled. Declan told me the funds were a bridge loan from your family trust. I swear to you, I did not know the notary seal was fake. Do not insult my intelligence, I replied, the temperature of my voice dropping. You received the wire request at 2:14 in the afternoon. My primary mobile device never triggered a dual-factor security alert. You manually overrode the fraud prevention protocol because you needed that cash to save your own investment. You are a co-conspirator in a federal crime, and the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to dissect your entire life. There was a frantic shuffling of paper on his end. Carson, we can fix this. I can reverse the freeze on your checking account right now. I can restore your access. Just tell me what you want. Do not send that email. I had him. The institutional firewall was broken. He was no longer a bank manager dictating terms. He was a hostage. You are going to do exactly 3 things I instructed delivering the terms of his surrender. First, you will immediately lift the security freeze on all of my personal accounts. I want full liquidity restored in the next 60 seconds. Second, you are going to log into Declan's corporate profile. You are going to flag every account associated with his venture capital firm for suspected fraud. You will freeze his operational capital just like you froze mine. Gregory hesitated, the silence thick with terror. If I freeze his corporate accounts, his payroll will bounce. His investors will demand an audit. It will trigger a systemic collapse of his firm. That is the objective, I said. I heard the rapid clatter of a keyboard. He was complying. He was trading my brother's survival for his own. What is the third thing, he asked, his voice trembling. I looked down at the digital invitation resting in my email inbox, a message forwarded to me earlier that week. The third thing requires your silence, I said. My mother and my sister-in-law are co-chairing a prestigious charity gala tomorrow night at the country club. The entire Chicago elite will be there. Declan will be there, trying to secure his final round of investor capital. You are not going to warn him about the frozen accounts. You are going to let him walk into that ballroom believing he is invincible. If I stay quiet, you delete the federal complaint, Gregory asked, desperate for a binding agreement. If you stay quiet, you keep your freedom for 1 more day, I corrected him. Do not mistake this for forgiveness. I ended the call. Within seconds, my banking application pinged with a push notification. The red warning banner vanished from my screen. My account balances populated, showing my operational funds fully restored. The financial blockade was lifted. I had my money, my physical mobility, and the digital evidence required to initiate a total structural collapse. My brother thought he could steal my future to finance his ego. My mother thought she could forge my name to maintain her suburban aesthetic. They built their house of cards on the assumption that I would quietly absorb the damage. Tomorrow night, in front of the wealthiest families in the city, I was going to set that house on fire. The Oakbrook Country Club ballroom smelled of roasted tenderloin and white freesia. A string quartet played a subtle Vivaldi arrangement from a raised dais in the corner, providing a sophisticated acoustic backdrop to the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. This was the annual Spring Charity Gala, an event where the Chicago elite gathered to trade social currency and evaluate each other's net worth. My mother and my sister-in-law were the co-chairs of the evening. They stood near the grand entrance, greeting the arriving guests with curated warmth. Patricia wore a tailored navy silk gown, her neck adorned with a strand of authentic pearls. Victoria flanked her in a striking emerald satin dress, her metallic handbag swapped for a jeweled clutch. They were the architects of this evening, standing at the absolute center of their fabricated social empire. They looked invincible. I stepped out of a black town car and handed the driver a crisp bill. The night air was biting, but I did not wear a coat. I wore a high-necked black crepe dress specifically designed to conceal the rigid cervical collar locked around my throat. My bruised ribs throbbed in time with my pulse, but I pushed the physical pain deep into a locked compartment of my mind. I gripped my carbon fiber cane, the synthetic material cool against my palm. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the marble foyer. The tip of my cane struck the polished stone with a sharp, rhythmic click. I did not have an invitation, but the young attendant at the guest registry recognized my face from family photographs and waved me through. I bypassed the coat check and entered the main ballroom. The ambient chatter of 200 wealthy guests washed over me. I stood near a tower of champagne glasses, scanning the room, until my eyes found my mother. Patricia was holding court with Edmund and Claire Caldwell. The Caldwell family owned a dominant chain of commercial real estate brokerages across the Midwest. They represented the exact tier of wealth and influence my mother desperately craved. I moved through the crowd, my synthetic cane clearing a path as guests instinctively stepped aside for the injured woman. I approached my mother from her blind spot. Patricia laughed at a joke Edmund made, tossing her head back in practiced delight. "It is just a matter of having an eye for emerging markets," she told him, her voice carrying over the string quartet. "Declan is brilliant at identifying undervalued assets. In fact, he is closing on a $1.2 million waterfront estate in Lake Geneva next week. We are thrilled for him and Victoria." I stopped right behind her shoulder. "He certainly found a creative way to fund the escrow," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. Patricia froze. The blood drained from her face so fast her foundation looked like chalk. She turned slowly, her curated smile fracturing as she took in my presence. She saw the black dress. She saw the heavy orthopedic brace hidden beneath the fabric. She saw the dark synthetic cane. Carson Patricia breathed, her vocal cords tightening. "You should be in the recovery ward." I decided I felt strong enough for an outing, I replied, stepping up to stand beside her. The Caldwells watched our exchange with polite curiosity. Edmund extended a manicured hand. "You must be the daughter who had that terrible accident on the interstate. Patricia told us you were fighting for your life. We are glad to see you on your feet." "Thank you, Edmund," I said, accepting his handshake. "I have an exceptional legal and medical team. They work very fast. My mother was just telling you about my brother's new real estate acquisition. It is a fascinating transaction. An all-cash closing orchestrated in a matter of days." Claire Caldwell raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "All cash for a Lake Geneva estate? Your brother must be running a very successful fund." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, desperate to steer the conversation away from the financial mechanics, but her throat clicked dry. She was trapped. She could not cause a scene. She could not grab my arm and drag me out of the ballroom. Any display of hostility would ruin her reputation in front of the exact people she spent years courting. She was a hostage to her own vanity. "It takes a unique kind of leverage to move that much capital," I told Claire, smiling flawlessly. "Declan utilizes an offshore holding company to secure his assets. It keeps the accounting very private." The Caldwells nodded, impressed by the sophisticated financial jargon. Edmund checked his watch and tapped his wife on the elbow. "We need to go bid on the silent auction before they close the tables," he said. "It was wonderful to meet you, Carson, Patricia. We will catch up over dessert." The wealthy couple drifted away, disappearing into the sea of tailored suits and evening gowns. The moment they were out of earshot, Patricia grabbed my elbow. Her manicured fingernails dug into my skin. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are going to ruin this evening." I pulled my arm free, my expression hardening into a mask of pure ice. "I pulled the state corporate registry for Apex Holding Solutions this afternoon," I whispered back, leaning close enough to smell the fear radiating off her skin. "I know about the Wilmington mail drop. I know about the misspelled fiduciary clause. I know you forged my signature while a surgeon was reconstructing my collarbone." Patricia stopped breathing. Her eyes dilated, darting frantically around the room to see if anyone was listening. The elegant facade she spent a lifetime building was peeling away, exposing the terrified thief underneath. I also know you used my stolen funds to buy those ghost orchids I continued sipping from a glass of sparkling water a passing waiter had handed me. You funded your own pity party with my life savings. A hired event photographer stepped in front of us, raising a heavy digital camera. "Smile, ladies," he chirped, oblivious to the psychological execution taking place. I turned toward the lens and offered a bright, authentic smile. Patricia stared into the flash, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The shutter snapped, forever documenting the exact second she realized her life was over. "Enjoy the tenderloin, Mother," I said, stepping away. "I have to go compliment Victoria on her dress." I navigated through the tables, tracking the emerald satin gown across the room. Victoria was standing near the silent auction displays, admiring a crystal vase. She held a glass of white wine, tapping her designer heel in time with the music. "Hello, Victoria," I said, stopping a few feet away. She turned, her eyes widening as she took in my physical state. "Carson, what on earth are you doing here? You look like you should be attached to a monitor." I ignored the insult. "That emerald shade is striking on you," I observed, letting my gaze sweep over her expensive attire. "It is an exquisite choice for a federal indictment." Victoria frowned, a wrinkle forming between her eyebrows. "What kind of medication are you taking? You are not making any sense." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear the destruction. "Marcus filed a notice of pending litigation against the Lake Geneva property 20 minutes ago. The Wisconsin County Clerk authorized a freeze on the entire holding account. Lakeshore Title and Escrow cannot transfer the deed. The $1.2 million transaction is dead." The wine glass trembled in her hand. A few drops of pale liquid spilled over the rim, staining the white linen tablecloth. "What did you do?" Victoria demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "That is Declan's investor capital. You have no right to interfere with his corporate acquisitions." "It is not investor capital," I corrected her, watching the confusion fracture her fragile reality. "Declan does not have a Silicon Valley angel investor. He is broke. His tech platform is failing. He stole my $318 emergency fund to cover the earnest money for your dream house. He lied to you, Victoria, and because your name is on the purchase agreement, you are legally tied to a wire fraud investigation." Victoria stared at me, her mouth parting in silent horror. She tried to formulate a response, tried to call me a liar, but the clinical certainty in my eyes extinguished her defense. She realized her husband had not just deceived her, he had exposed her to federal prosecution. Her wealthy suburban fantasy dissolved, leaving her standing in a borrowed dress on top of a crime scene. A sudden shift in the ambient noise drew my attention toward the foyer. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Declan walked into the ballroom. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, projecting the image of a visionary tech founder ready to woo his final round of investors. But his posture betrayed him. His shoulders were tight. He was staring at his mobile phone, his thumb swiping frantically across the screen. Gregory had followed my instructions. Declan's corporate payroll accounts were frozen. The financial lifeblood of his venture capital firm was cut off, and his bank manager was not answering the phone. He was walking into a high society gala while his empire was burning to the ground. Declan shoved the phone into his pocket and looked up, scanning the room for his wife and his mother. His eyes swept over the silent auction tables, past the string quartet, and locked onto me. He saw me leaning on the carbon fiber cane. He saw his mother standing frozen by the champagne tower, looking like she was about to faint. He saw his wife staring at him with a look of undisguised horror. The arrogant, untouchable smirk vanished from my brother's face. In that single, electric moment across a crowded ballroom, the dynamic permanently shifted. Declan realized the bank error was not a glitch. He realized his secret Delaware shell company was compromised. He realized he was the prey. The morning sun, reflecting off the pristine waters of Lake Geneva, provided a picturesque backdrop for what Declan assumed would be his crowning achievement. He navigated his leased luxury sport utility vehicle into the private parking lot of Lakeshore Title and Escrow, shifting the transmission into park with a smooth, practiced motion. The Wisconsin air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and fresh freshwater spray. It was the perfect environment for a newly minted tech millionaire to secure his waterfront legacy. Declan had spent the entire 2-hour drive north soothing his wife. He spun a masterful narrative to explain away the disastrous confrontation at the charity gala the night before. He insisted my threats were empty, framing my behavior as the erratic, bitter ravings of a sibling heavily medicated on post-surgical painkillers. He assured Victoria that my claims about frozen accounts and stolen funds were pure fabrication, a jealous attempt to sabotage his skyrocketing success. He believed Gregory was still maintaining the financial blockade in Chicago. He thought his corporate payroll glitch was merely a temporary server routing error that his technical team would resolve by Monday morning. Arrogance is a formidable anesthetic against reality. Victoria walked beside him toward the brick facade of the title company, her designer sunglasses shielding her eyes from the glare. She wanted the vacation home with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Her desire to decorate the boathouse and host summer cocktail parties for the Chicago elite allowed her to willfully ignore the terrifying financial specifics I had whispered into her ear. She chose to believe her husband, because the alternative required her to acknowledge she was married to a fraud. A seasoned closing agent named Harrison ushered them into a corner conference room. The space was designed to make wealthy clients feel secure, featuring polished mahogany paneling, high-backed leather chairs, and a panoramic window overlooking the lake. Harrison offered them sparkling water and artisanal pastries, projecting the quiet competence expected during a 7-figure real estate transaction. Declan took his seat at the head of the table, exuding the relaxed confidence of a Silicon Valley visionary. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back, ready to finalize the purchase. "We have all the preliminary disclosures out of the way," Harrison said, opening a thick, leather-bound folio. "The title search came back clean yesterday afternoon. We are just waiting on the final wire confirmation from your Delaware holding company to clear the escrow account. Once you sign the transfer deed, I can hand you the keys to the property." Harrison slid the heavy parchment across the polished wood, placing it directly in front of my brother. Declan reached into his interior pocket and withdrew a silver fountain pen. He rolled the cold metal between his fingers, savoring the climax of his social climbing. This signature was supposed to be his ultimate victory, the tangible proof that he had outmaneuvered his sister and secured his status among the wealthy elite. He lowered the nib toward the signature line. The multi-line telephone sitting in the center of the conference table flashed a bright, rhythmic red. Harrison frowned, glancing at the flashing indicator. "Apologies, Mr. Onyx. My front desk knows not to interrupt a closing unless it is an urgent banking matter. Give me one moment." The agent pressed the speaker button. "Yes, Diane, what is the issue?" "Harrison, it is the compliance department in Chicago," the receptionist announced, her voice clipped and tight with tension. "You need to pull the Apex Holding Solutions file right now. Do not execute the deed." Declan froze. The silver pen hovered an inch above the paper. The practiced, relaxed smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, rigid stillness. "What is the problem with the file?" Harrison asked, his professional demeanor shifting into a cautious, guarded tone. "We just received a direct notification from the Cook County Judicial Clerk," the receptionist explained. "A federal judge approved an emergency injunction an hour ago. A formal notice of pending litigation has been attached to the property parcel. The originating funds in the escrow account are currently frozen under a federal warrant." Harrison stared at the flashing speakerphone processing the legal terminology. "On what grounds, Diane?" "The paperwork cites suspected interstate wire fraud and grand larceny," she replied. "The authorities flagged the entire $318,000 deposit as stolen capital. The escrow is locked. We are required to terminate the closing immediately and hold the funds pending an FBI investigation." Harrison reached out and terminated the call. The silence that followed was suffocating. The picturesque view of the lake outside the window suddenly felt like a painted backdrop to a crime scene. The seasoned broker did not raise his voice. He simply reached across the mahogany table and pulled the unexecuted transfer deed away from Declan, sliding it back into the leather folio. Victoria sat paralyzed in her chair. The designer sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose. The deliberate, careful illusion her husband had constructed shattered into jagged pieces on the conference room floor. The terrifying warnings I delivered at the charity gala were not the ravings of a medicated woman. They were a precise, tactical forecast. Declan scrambled to salvage the narrative. "There has to be a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking as he reached toward the agent. "My angel investor must have flagged the wire by mistake. I can call my banking executive right now and clear this up. It is just a routine compliance check." Harrison closed the leather folio and stood up. "Mr. Onyx, a federal judge does not issue a lis pendens for a routine compliance check. The deposit sitting in our escrow account is now classified as evidence in a grand larceny investigation. I cannot conduct business with your holding company. I must ask you both to leave the premises immediately." Victoria turned her head slowly, locking her gaze onto her husband. The shock contorting her features rapidly hardened into raw, unfiltered rage. Her social standing was her most prized possession, and she was currently sitting in a respected brokerage firm being accused of federal wire fraud. "Where is the angel investor capital, Declan?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a terrifying quietness. "You looked me in the eye and swore you secured a Silicon Valley funding round." Declan shrank back against the leather chair. The smooth, charismatic venture capitalist was gone, replaced by a terrified thief caught in a trap he could not charm his way out of. Victoria did not wait for his pathetic explanation. She stood up, grabbed her handbag, and walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving him alone to face the wreckage of his own arrogance. 80 miles south, the atmosphere in my attorney's office provided a stark contrast to the panic unfolding in Wisconsin. Marcus occupied a sprawling corner suite overlooking the Chicago River. The room smelled of polished mahogany and old paper, a testament to decades of quiet, lethal corporate litigation. I sat in a high-backed leather armchair, resting my carbon fiber cane across my knees. My fractured collarbone throbbed, a dull baseline of pain that kept my mind sharp and focused. My mobile phone sat in the center of Marcus's desk. The speakerphone was activated, playing a voicemail Declan had left 3 minutes prior. "Carson, you need to call me back right now," Declan's voice echoed through the quiet office. He sounded breathless, frantic, pacing around an empty parking lot. The audio documented his rapid psychological descent. He started with demands, trying to assert his faded authority. "You have no idea the damage you are causing. You are disrupting a major corporate acquisition. You need to call your lawyers and drop this ridiculous injunction before I sue you for tortious interference." When the demands echoed into silence, the bargaining began. His tone shifted, dropping the aggressive posture for a desperate negotiation. "Look, we can fix this. I know you are angry about the emergency loan. I get it. But freezing the escrow hurts all of us. If you lift the lis pendens and let the sale go through, I will sign a binding promissory note today. I will pay you back with interest. Just let me close on the house, Carson. Please." The bargaining lasted for 30 seconds before the reality of the grand larceny charge finally crushed his remaining ego. The recording transitioned into pure, pathetic begging. "Carson, they are talking about the FBI. Victoria left me at the title company. My payroll accounts are locked. Gregory is not answering his phone. I have nothing left. You are my sister. You have to stop this. Mom is terrified. You cannot send your own family to prison over a misunderstanding. Please just pick up the phone. I will do whatever you want." I did not let the voicemail finish. I reached forward and tapped the delete icon on the screen. The frantic pleading was instantly erased, replaced by the quiet hum of the city traffic outside the window. Marcus watched me from across the desk, his hands steepled together. "We secured the physical capital," he noted, his tone professional and detached. The $318,000 is locked in the Wisconsin account. Once the civil fraud judgment clears, the funds will be wired directly back into your restored banking profile. You won the financial war. I leaned back against the leather upholstery, staring at the dark screen of my phone. Recovering the stolen funds was the initial objective, but it was no longer the final destination. My family viewed my success as a resource to be harvested, and my boundaries as inconveniences to be ignored. If I simply took my money back and walked away, the underlying structure of their entitlement would remain intact. They would view the ordeal as a failed business transaction, an unfortunate setback in their ongoing pursuit of unearned luxury. I did not just want my money back. I required a total structural collapse. To ensure this betrayal could never be repeated, the family unit itself had to be dismantled. They had to be stripped of their shared illusions and forced to confront the reality of their own greed. Declan was broken and isolated, but my mother still believed she could control the narrative. Patricia still thought she could hide her forged signature behind the facade of a protective matriarch. She still believed her husband was a compliant, oblivious pawn. I picked up my carbon fiber cane and stood up, testing my weight against the synthetic shaft. "We have the money, Marcus," I said, turning toward the heavy oak door. "But the architecture of their lie is still standing. It is time to let them tear each other apart." The FBI was already reviewing the bank logs, but a federal investigation moves at a bureaucratic crawl. I needed an immediate, visceral detonation. I needed the matriarch to realize her golden child viewed her as entirely disposable, and I needed it captured on a digital recording. The Sunday family dinner was approaching, and my father was carrying the wire. The final trap was primed. The scent of roasted rosemary and garlic drifted through the pristine corridors of the Naperville estate. Sunday family dinner was a sacred institution in my mother's household. For 3 decades, Patricia used this weekly gathering to project an image of suburban perfection, arranging her husband and children around a mahogany dining table like carefully polished chess pieces. Tonight, the dining room sat empty. The silver cutlery remained perfectly aligned next to untouched porcelain plates. The roast was burning in the oven, forgotten, because the illusion of safety had just been shattered by a single phone call. Earlier that afternoon, a federal agent from the Financial Crimes Division left a voicemail on the household landline. He requested a formal interview regarding a disputed power of attorney and a suspicious wire transfer originating from Illinois Heritage Bank. The federal government was no longer a distant, abstract threat. The authorities were standing on the front porch, preparing to knock. Patricia sat rigid on the edge of her white linen sofa. She wore a tailored cashmere sweater, clutching a velvet throw pillow against her chest, as if it could stop a bullet. She stared at the front door, waiting for her golden child to arrive and fix the nightmare they had engineered together. The heavy oak door swung open, slamming against the drywall. Declan stumbled into the foyer. He looked nothing like the polished, charismatic venture capitalist who had confidently walked into the charity gala the night before. His suit jacket was missing, his silk tie hung loose around his neck, and his dress shirt was stained with sweat. He paced across the expensive Persian rug, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Did you get the call?" Declan demanded, his voice cracking as he paced the length of the living room. "Tell me you got the call from the agent." Patricia stood up, reaching out to comfort the son she had spent a lifetime protecting. She spent 30 years shielding him from the consequences of his own arrogance, fixing his grades in high school, paying off his youthful indiscretions, and validating every selfish decision he ever made. She expected him to embrace her, to tell her they would weather this storm together. "I got the voicemail," Patricia said, her voice trembling. "Declan, we need to hire a defense attorney. We need to call a crisis management firm. We can tell them it was a medical emergency. We can say we intended to pay Carson back." Declan stopped pacing. He turned to face his mother, his eyes dark and hollow. "There is no we in this scenario," he said, his tone devoid of any familial warmth. "The escrow account is frozen. Victoria walked out on me. My corporate payroll is locked, and the FBI is reviewing the bank logs. A crisis management firm cannot spin a federal indictment." He closed the distance between them, invading her personal space. He did not look at her like a son seeking comfort. He looked at her like a liability he needed to liquidate. "I have a venture capital board meeting tomorrow morning," Declan continued, his voice dropping into a cold, mechanical cadence. "My investors are demanding a full audit of my accounts. If I am indicted for wire fraud, my firm dissolves. My entire life is over. I am 32 years old. I have decades of earning potential ahead of me. You are 62. Patricia froze, the velvet pillow dropping from her hands. She did not comprehend the arithmetic he was calculating. "What are you saying?" "I am saying you need to act like a mother," Declan instructed, his words sharp and deliberate. "You need to call that federal agent back tomorrow morning. You are going to confess. You will tell them you acted alone. You will say you panicked over Dad's debt, found the blank forms in Carson's office, and executed the transfer yourself to save the family." The living room descended into a suffocating silence. Patricia stared at her son, her chest tightening as the reality of his demand settled over her. "You will tell them I had no idea the funds were stolen," Declan pushed, pressing his advantage. "You will say you transferred the money into my holding company under the guise of an anonymous angel investment. You are a senior citizen with no criminal record. You are a sympathetic suburban housewife who made a desperate mistake to protect her husband. A judge will give you probation and a fine. If I go down, I lose everything. You have to take the fall." The psychological fracture was instantaneous and absolute. Patricia had spent her entire adult life worshiping at the altar of her son's potential. She alienated her daughter, enabled her husband, and compromised her own morality to ensure Declan never faced an obstacle he could not overcome. She believed her devotion would be rewarded with lifelong loyalty. In her darkest hour, her golden child did not offer her a shield. He pushed her directly into the line of fire. He viewed her as entirely disposable, a convenient scapegoat to preserve his corporate reputation. "I am your mother," Patricia whispered, her voice fracturing into a ragged sob. "I forged that document for you. You told me it was the only way to save your company. You told me Carson would never find out. I committed a felony to secure your future, and you are asking me to go to federal prison so you can keep your venture capital firm?" Declan dropped the mask of the panicked son. His posture straightened, his expression hardening into genuine cruelty. The entitlement she nurtured in him had mutated into a weapon, and he was pointing it directly at her chest. "Do not play the martyr with me," he snapped, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You did not do this just for me. You did it because you are addicted to the country club lifestyle. You could not stomach the idea of Dad dragging your social standing through the mud over a wine invoice. You wanted the quick fix." Patricia took a step back, her hands shaking. "I will not confess to acting alone. I will not let you sacrifice me." Declan let out a harsh, venomous laugh. "You do not have a choice. Look at the physical evidence. You held the pen. You stamped the notary's seal. You walked into the bank and handed the paperwork to Gregory. The security cameras captured your face, not mine. And let us not forget the corporate credit card. You used the stolen capital to buy rare orchids from a Delaware shell company. You created the paper trail. The federal prosecutor will not need a confession. They already have you on paper." He leaned closer, delivering the final, devastating blow. "You are already guilty. I am just asking you to control the narrative so one of us survives." A floorboard creaked in the darkened hallway leading to the kitchen. Declan and Patricia snapped their heads toward the sound. The shadows shifted, and Richard Onyx stepped into the soft light of the living room. My father wore the same wrinkled suit from his hospital visit the day before. He looked tired, but the pathetic, defeated posture was gone. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, projecting a quiet, lethal authority he had not displayed in decades. For 35 years, Richard was the passive observer in this house. He let his wife dictate the family narrative and allowed his son to eclipse his own mediocre achievements. He retreated to the golf course and the corner booth of the country club, ignoring the toxic dynamic rotting his family from the inside. He was passive no longer. Richard walked slowly into the center of the living room, stopping halfway between his wife and his son. He reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. His hand emerged, holding the sleek, black digital audio recorder I had given him in the recovery ward. A small, steady red light glowed on the top of the device. Declan stared at the metal rectangle, his corporate brain struggling to process the visual information. Patricia gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "I thought my vanity was the ugliest thing in this house," Richard said, his voice rumbling with a dark, unfamiliar gravity. "I thought my foolish desire to impress my friends with expensive wine was the catalyst that destroyed my daughter. I sat in a hospital chair yesterday and wept because I believed my weakness forced you to steal." Richard looked directly into his son's eyes. "You let me believe it. You placed your hand on my shoulder and told me you would fix my mistake. You used my shame to blind me while you built a Delaware shell company and cloned your sister's phone." "Dad, what are you doing?" Declan stammered, taking a cautious step backward. "Turn that thing off." Richard ignored the command. He turned his gaze to Patricia. She shrank under his scrutiny, realizing the husband she viewed as a manageable pawn was holding the instrument of her destruction. "You let him convince you I was a threat to your social standing," Richard told his wife. "You forged our daughter's name because you care more about the opinions of the Caldwell family than you care about your own blood. You broke her, and now he is trying to break you." Richard pressed a button on the side of the device. The red light clicked off, saving the audio file. He had captured every word. He captured Declan demanding his mother take the fall. He captured the admission of the shell company, the forged seal, the credit card transactions, and the explicit acknowledgement that the funds were stolen. It was an uncoerced, highly detailed confession, recorded legally within the confines of a private residence by a participating party. "Give me the recorder," Declan demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate growl. He lunged forward, reaching for the device. Richard did not flinch. He sidestepped the clumsy attack, shoving his son backward with a firm hand against his chest. Declan stumbled, crashing into a glass end table. The crystal lamp shattered across the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent punctuation to the end of their family unit. "I'm taking this audio file to Carson's attorney," Richard announced, his voice echoing through the silent, fractured room. "I am handing the federal prosecutor the exact narrative they need. You are both going to answer for what you did to her." Richard turned his back on his wife and his son. He walked out the front door, stepping into the cool night air, leaving the mahogany dining table and the burning roast behind forever. The Naperville estate was quiet once again, but the silence was agonizing. The family unit had completely disintegrated. Patricia sank onto the white linen sofa, burying her face in her hands, paralyzed by the inescapable legal nightmare she had initiated. She had no defense, no husband, and no son. Declan slowly picked himself up from the floor, brushing the shattered glass from his trousers. He was entirely isolated. His mother was a liability. His father was an informant. His sister was a predator. His accounts were frozen and the FBI was building a case. But Declan was a man accustomed to surviving in the ruthless environment of venture capital. When a corporate entity faces total liquidation, a desperate founder will burn the entire sector down to secure a single lifeline. He had an emergency board meeting scheduled for the following morning. He had 12 hours to spin the narrative, secure a bridge loan, and outmaneuver the federal freeze. He had one final, desperate move left to play, and he intended to execute it before the sun came up. Monday morning arrived with the gray, overcast chill typical of Chicago in early spring. The executive boardroom of Vanguard Capital Partners occupied the 42nd floor of a steel and glass high-rise in the Loop. The space was engineered to intimidate, featuring a sprawling polished granite table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, and soundproof glass walls that insulated the room from the noise of the city below. Declan stood at the head of the table fighting for his corporate survival. 4 senior venture capital partners sat across from him, their faces impassive, their expensive pens tapping in unison against leather portfolios. My brother projected a presentation slide displaying fabricated growth metrics onto the massive digital display behind him. He wore a fresh tailored suit, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the frantic, sleepless night he spent trying to salvage his imploding tech startup. He was cornered, relying on his charisma to spin a lethal crisis into a minor speed bump. We encountered a minor administrative friction over the weekend. Declan explained his tone smooth, projecting the unearned confidence he always used to manipulate wealthy men. A clerical routing error at Illinois Heritage Bank triggered a temporary hold on our operational accounts and a secondary real estate escrow deposit. My technical team is resolving the anomaly as we speak. The bridge loan he discussed this morning will provide the necessary liquidity to bypass this delay and keep our product launch on schedule. The lead investor, a sharp-eyed man named Sterling, leaned forward and steepled his fingers on the granite surface. A banking glitch does not usually result in frozen corporate payroll, Declan. We heard rumors of a federal injunction attached to your Lake Geneva property acquisition. We do not underwrite companies with active federal inquiries. It is a civil misunderstanding, Declan countered swiftly, forcing a reassuring bright smile. A dispute over a family trust. The hold will be lifted by tomorrow morning, and our ledger will be completely clear. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open, severing his pitch. I stepped into the room. The tip of my carbon fiber cane struck the granite floor with a sharp, echoing click. Marcus walked on my right, carrying his slim leather briefcase. On my left walked a stoic, broad-shouldered man in a dark, off-the-rack suit. He carried a badge case clipped to his leather belt. He was an auditor for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The silence in the boardroom was immediate and heavy. The investors turned their heads, analyzing the intrusion with calculating stares. Declan stopped breathing. His hands gripped the edges of the granite table so tight, his knuckles turned a sickly white. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He thought the destruction of his family unit the night before was the climax of the war. He did not realize it was merely the prologue. Carson Declan stammered, his voice dropping the charismatic pitch and fracturing in the quiet room. "You cannot be in here. This is a closed board meeting." "I am not here to attend your meeting, Declan," I replied, walking slowly toward the head of the table. Every step sent a sharp jolt of pain up my healing spine, but I kept my posture rigid and unyielding. "I am here to correct your quarterly earnings report." Marcus did not wait for an invitation to proceed. He stepped past the seated investors, walked directly to the presentation podium, and unplugged Declan's laptop from the audiovisual system. He connected his own encrypted tablet. The fabricated growth metrics vanished from the large digital screen, replaced instantly by a stark white background containing 3 distinct legal documents. "What is the meaning of this?" Sterling demanded, standing up from his leather executive chair. "Who are you people?" "My name is Carson Onyx," I told the investors, keeping my gaze locked entirely on my brother. "I am the source of the capital Mr. Onyx is currently trying to claim as corporate revenue. The man on my left is Agent Reynolds. We are here to notify this board that Vanguard Capital Partners is the subject of an active federal wire fraud investigation." The tension in the room spiked to a suffocating degree. The wealthy men sitting around the table exchanged nervous, calculating glances. In the high-stakes world of venture capital, association with a federal crime is a terminal disease. Declan raised his hands, adopting a posture of frantic defense. "Do not listen to her," he pleaded, his voice cracking as he looked at Sterling. "She is my sister. We are going through a hostile probate dispute over my father's estate. She is trying to sabotage my firm out of pure spite." I nodded to Marcus. He tapped the tablet screen. The first document expanded on the digital display, filling the room with high-resolution text. "That is a sworn affidavit from a licensed state notary," I explained, the temperature of my voice dropping to a clinical chill. "She confesses under penalty of perjury that Declan Onyx bribed her to authenticate a forged power of attorney. He used that fraudulent document to liquidate my high-yield savings account to cover his own corporate debts." Marcus tapped the screen again. A medical chart appeared next to the affidavit. "That is the surgical timeline from Northwestern Memorial Hospital." I continued my words, landing like hammer strikes in the quiet room. It proves my chest was open under general anesthesia at the exact minute the bank transfer was authorized. Declan took a step back, his shoulder hitting the presentation whiteboard. The color drained entirely from his face. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the steel trap was permanently sealed. Marcus tapped the screen a third time, bringing up the IP routing logs. And that is the digital handshake verifying the dual-factor authentication code I concluded. The signal pinged from a coffee shop 3 blocks from this office, traced directly to a mobile device registered to your chief executive. He did not encounter a banking anomaly. He stole $318,000 to artificially inflate his balance sheet and defraud this investment board. The investors stared at the screen, silently digesting the irrefutable forensic math. "You are lying," a sharp, desperate voice echoed from the back of the room. Victoria stepped out from the shadows near the catering console. She'd arrived at the office early, desperate to monitor the bridge loan meeting, clinging to the fading hope that her husband could secure the cash to save her suburban lifestyle. She looked exhausted, her designer clothes wrinkled from a sleepless night, but her eyes burned with toxic defiance. She walked toward the center of the room, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think you are so brilliant, Carson, but you audit prominent corporations. You have access to sensitive client ledgers. If you do not drop this injunction and walk out of this room right now, I will call the financial press. I will tell them you use proprietary insider information to short stocks. I will destroy your accounting firm before you destroy my husband." It was a pathetic, last-ditch blackmail attempt fabricated entirely from her own panic. She was trying to create leverage where none existed, threatening my professional reputation in a desperate bid to force a financial settlement. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into Marcus's open briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. I placed it on the granite table and slid it across the polished stone until it bumped against Victoria's hand. "Open it," I instructed. Victoria stared at the folder, her bravado faltering under the weight of my calm directive. She slowly opened the cover. "That is a draft of a federal racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations indictment," I explained, letting the severe legal terminology suffocate the remaining air in the room. "It names you as a primary co-conspirator in a continuing criminal enterprise." Victoria shook her head, taking a step away from the heavy granite table. "I did not steal anything. I did not sign that bank transfer. Federal courts recognize the concept of willful blindness." I told her, my tone devoid of any human sympathy. "You spent the stolen capital. You signed the escrow purchase agreement for the Lake Geneva property using funds you knew lacked a legitimate origin. You enjoyed the proceeds of a criminal enterprise while actively ignoring the source of the funding. If you contact the press, or if you interfere with this investigation in any capacity, Agent Reynolds will execute that warrant today. You will trade your designer wardrobe for a federal uniform." Victoria looked down at the drafted indictment, her eyes scanning the severe federal charges listed under her own name. The gravity of the evidence shattered her final illusion. She was not a wealthy socialite defending her empire. She was an unindicted accomplice standing in a room full of federal targets. She dropped the folder onto the granite table. She did not look at her husband. She turned around and fled the boardroom, her heels clicking rapidly down the corridor until the sound faded into silence. She abandoned Declan to the predators to save herself. Sterling, the lead investor, buttoned his suit jacket and picked up his leather portfolio with a look of pure disgust. "Vanguard Capital Partners is pulling all term sheets," Sterling announced, his voice sharp and decisive as he glared at my brother. "We are initiating an immediate clawback of our initial seed funding. The board will be notifying our legal counsel to file a civil claim for fraudulent misrepresentation by the end of the business day." Declan reached out his hand, trembling as he tried to grasp Sterling's sleeve. "You cannot pull the funding. If you trigger a clawback, the brokerage will issue a margin call on my entire portfolio. It will liquidate every asset I own to cover the deficit. I will be bankrupt by noon." Sterling pulled his arm away, refusing to let the desperate man touch his suit. "You are already bankrupt, Mr. Onyx. You just have not done the math yet." The investors filed out of the boardroom in a swift, silent procession, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Agent Reynolds followed them into the hallway, standing guard by the glass doors sealing the perimeter for the incoming federal raid. Only Declan Marcus and I remained in the sprawling executive suite. My brother stood at the head of the long granite table, entirely alone. The charismatic facade was permanently stripped away, leaving a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His wife was gone, his investors were gone, his stolen capital was frozen. He looked at the digital screen, staring at the forensic evidence projecting his crimes in high definition. The ego that defined his entire existence was publicly executed. He finally understood the gravity of his mistake. He thought he could steal from the quiet, sturdy sister and suffer no consequences. I leaned my weight onto the carbon fiber cane, turning my back on him and walking toward the exit. The structural collapse was complete. There was nothing left for me to take. 6 months is a brief duration in the grand architecture of a human life, but within the rigid machinery of federal prosecution, it is sufficient time to grind a fragile empire into dust. The legal system moved with the relentless mechanical precision Marcus and I had engineered. Faced with the routing logs, the notarized affidavit, and the covert audio recording, my brother realized a trial would result in a decade behind bars. His defense team advised him to accept a binding plea agreement. I sat in the gallery of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse when the judge delivered the sentencing order. Declan wore a shapeless khaki uniform, his wrists secured by standard-issue steel cuffs. He received 36 months in a minimum security correctional facility for wire fraud and conspiracy. The charismatic venture capitalist who once commanded glass boardrooms was reduced to a digitized inmate number, stripped of his bespoke suits and his unearned arrogance. He glanced back at the gallery before the federal marshals escorted him through the heavy wooden doors. Our eyes locked for a fraction of a second. I did not smile or offer a parting remark. I simply held his gaze until he looked away, acknowledging the hierarchy had been permanently corrected. My mother avoided the physical confinement of a prison cell, but her punishment was arguably more severe for a woman whose entire identity relied on social perception. The prosecutor offered Patricia a grueling plea arrangement in exchange for her full cooperation against her own son. She received 5 years of supervised probation and a 6-figure restitution mandate that drained the remaining equity from her pristine Naperville estate. The bank foreclosed on the property within 90 days. She was forced to relocate to a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The country club formally revoked her membership. The Caldwell family and the rest of the Chicago elite erased her from their social registries, treating her name like a contagious pathogen. She spends her days navigating cracked linoleum floors and listening to the hum of a failing refrigerator, surrounded by the ghosts of her curated suburban aesthetic. My father filed for divorce the day after she signed her confession, moving to a quiet coastal town in Florida and severing all contact. She is entirely alone with the wreckage she created. The true poetry of their ruin lies in the specific geometry of their collateral damage. Victoria attempted to salvage her own status by immediately filing for a contested divorce. She demanded exorbitant alimony and a favorable division of corporate assets, unaware that a federal freeze supersedes domestic litigation. The government seized the venture capital firm, the Delaware Holding Company, and every liquid dollar tied to her husband. Victoria walked out of family court with a stack of worthless legal documents and zero capital. Her designer wardrobe and her metallic handbags were liquidated to satisfy her retaining attorneys. Destitute, alienated from her wealthy social circles, and lacking any marketable professional skills, she faced imminent homelessness. In a twist of exquisite irony, she had only one remaining option. Victoria packed her few remaining suitcases and moved into the cramped apartment with her disgraced mother-in-law. They cannot afford a vehicle, so they rely on public transportation, enduring the humiliation of waiting at bus stops in their fading designer coats. Every morning, Patricia wakes up on a sagging pull-out couch, while Victoria occupies the only bedroom. They spend their evenings fighting over the grocery budget, weaponizing their regrets against one another. The psychological confinement is far worse than any iron cell the government could have designed. Two women who built their relationship on mutual disdain and the performance of wealth are now trapped in 300 square feet of shared misery, blaming each other for the collapse of their fraudulent dynasty. The criminal proceedings satisfied the requirements of the law, but true retribution requires an uncompromising transfer of power. I did not just recover my original $318,000. I filed a civil suit against Vanguard Capital Partners for punitive damages resulting from fraudulent misrepresentation and gross negligence. The Venture Capital Board, terrified of a protracted public trial, opted for a swift, comprehensive settlement. In lieu of cash, which the firm lacked following the margin calls, I demanded the intellectual property rights to the proprietary software platform my brother had spent years developing. They signed the transfer agreements without hesitation, eager to shed the radioactive assets. I absorbed the technology into my own forensic accounting firm. My development team stripped the code, reconfigured the algorithms, and patented the platform as an advanced auditing tool designed to trace hidden corporate ledgers. The algorithm is now the industry standard for uncovering the exact type of Delaware tax havens and offshore ghost accounts my family attempted to use against me. Law firms and federal regulators pay exorbitant licensing fees to utilize the tool. My brother tried to steal my future to finance his technology. I legally seized his life work, branded it under my own name, and turned it into the most lucrative asset in my professional portfolio. The ultimate trophy of this war, however, was tangible. I secured the final asset through the federal civil forfeiture auction. I stand now in the sprawling, sunlit living room of the waterfront estate in Lake Geneva. The Wisconsin air coming through the open sliding glass doors smells of pine needles and fresh water. This is the exact property Declan tried to purchase with my stolen life savings. It is a stunning architectural achievement, featuring wide plank oak floors, a vaulted cedar ceiling, and a panoramic view of the private dock. I purchased it for pennies on the dollar, paying the government in a single, all-cash escrow transfer, just like Victoria had bragged about in my recovery room. The physical rehabilitation was grueling, requiring months of daily physical therapy to regain the range of motion in my spine. But the pain forged a synthetic resilience. I do not limp. My stride is measured and deliberate, punctuated only by the rhythmic tap of the composite cane against the hardwood. I lean comfortably on the carbon fiber shaft. My fractured collarbone has healed into a dense, calcified knot, a permanent physical reminder of the vulnerability I will never allow anyone to exploit again. The local postman delivered the mail an hour ago. Among the stack of corporate briefs and financial statements sits a plain white envelope. The return address belongs to the cramped apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. I recognize the looping, practiced handwriting of my mother. I slide a silver letter opener through the paper and unfold the single sheet of stationery. The ink is smudged, betraying a trembling hand. Patricia writes about the agonizing difficulty of sharing a single bathroom with Victoria. She complains about the mounting utility bills, the hostile arguments, and the cost of her monthly probation fees. The final paragraph is a desperate, pathetic plea for a bridge loan, a temporary allowance to help them survive the winter. She appeals to my sense of family, relying on the old, ingrained habit of the sturdy daughter fixing the broken pieces. I read the words, feeling the smooth texture of the paper against my fingertips. I do not feel anger. I do not feel sorrow. I feel the quiet, profound satisfaction of a closed ledger. I fold the letter meticulously, matching the corners with precise symmetry. I walk across the oak floor toward the heavy stone fireplace dominating the center of the room. A small fire crackles on the hearth, warding off the autumn chill. I hold the folded envelope over the open flame. The heat catches the edge of the paper, turning the white stationery a dark, curling brown before igniting into a bright yellow flare. I drop the burning letter onto the stacked logs. I stand in my own house, watching the words turn to ash, and wait for the embers to rise up the stone chimney, disappearing forever into the cold Wisconsin sky. The embers cooling in the stone fireplace of a Lake Geneva estate tell a story much older than wire fraud or corporate espionage. As the ashes of a mother's desperate letter drift upward, vanishing into the cold Wisconsin sky, we are forced to look away from the spectacular ruin of the Onyx family and stare into the quiet, often uncomfortable mirror of our own homes. The tragedy of Declan, Patricia, and Richard is not merely a tale of a stolen inheritance. It is a profound, terrifying autopsy of American parenting gone wrong. It asks us to examine the foundation upon which we build our families, stripping away the manicured lawns and country club memberships to reveal the raw, unpolished truth of how we guide our children into adulthood. In the pursuit of the modern dream, there is a dangerous temptation to substitute aesthetics for authenticity. Patricia Onyx built her entire maternal identity on the performance of success. She curated her family like a museum exhibit, ensuring the surface remained flawless while willfully ignoring the structural rot beneath. Parenting, however, is not a curation of appearances. It is the grueling, unglamorous work of character construction. When we raise children within a traditional family structure, we are tasked with instilling values that can withstand the friction of the real world. Honesty and fairness cannot be conditional. They cannot be discarded the moment they threaten our social standing or our comfort. By crowning Declan the golden child, insulated from consequence and praised solely for his charisma, his parents starved him of emotional awareness. They taught him that his potential was more valuable than his integrity. He learned that rules were flexible, that accountability was for the less fortunate, and that love was something transactional, measured in baubles and bridge loans. We see this subtle poison seeping into households every day. The urge to smooth over a child's failures, to write the check that covers the mistake, to blame the teacher, the coach, or the economy, rather than letting the child feel the healthy, instructive sting of consequence. When parents shield a child from their own failures, they do not create a successful adult. They forge a fragile ego that will eventually burn down the house to keep itself warm. Conversely, the Onyx family dynamic exposes the silent cruelty inflicted upon the sturdy child. Carson was raised not to be nurtured, but to be utilized. Her resilience was weaponized against her. In traditional family dynamics, there is often an unspoken expectation that the strongest sibling will naturally shoulder the burdens of the weakest. This is a perversion of family responsibility. True familial duty requires equitable moral standards. It demands that parents look at their children with clear, unbiased eyes, recognizing their individual humanity rather than their utility. When parents treat one child as a limitless resource and another as a fragile idol, they do not foster sibling loyalty. They lay the groundwork for a brutal, inevitable civil war. The passive complicity of the patriarch Richard offers perhaps the most chilling lesson in long-term guidance. A father's role in a traditional household is not merely to provide financial stability or to occupy a chair at the head of the dining table. It requires active, courageous, moral leadership. Richard chose the path of least resistance. He retreated into his own vanity, shrinking from the difficult conversations and looking the other way as his wife and son slowly abandoned their moral compasses. His silence was an endorsement. Children do not just learn from the lectures we deliver. They absorb the boundaries we fail to enforce. They watch the arguments we avoid. They internalize the lies we tolerate to keep the peace. Richard's tragic awakening in that hospital room reminds us that avoiding conflict in the present guarantees a catastrophe in the future. To raise a child in today's complex society requires a deliberate return to foundational emotional awareness. It means teaching a son that true strength lies in owning his failures, not in outsourcing his guilt. It means teaching a daughter that her worth is inherent, not tied to her ability to clean up the messes left by others. Fairness in parenting does not mean treating every child exactly the same. It means holding every child to the same unwavering standard of honesty. It requires parents to possess the emotional maturity to admit their own flaws, showing their children that integrity is a daily practice, not a static achievement. We must ask ourselves what narrative we are writing in the minds of our children. Are we teaching them that success justifies the means? Are we modeling a transactional love where affection is tied to achievements, high-tier universities, or corporate titles? Or are we instilling a quiet, unshakable moral framework that will guide them when the venture capital dries up and the applause fades? The Onyx family collapsed because their foundation was poured with pride instead of principle. They possessed every material advantage society could offer, yet they were profoundly, desperately impoverished in spirit. The path to avoiding such ruin is paved with uncomfortable truths. It requires sitting at the dinner table and having the hard conversations about character empathy and the real cost of a lie. It means valuing the unseen integrity of a quiet life over the loud, hollow performance of success. As we navigate the complexities of raising the next generation, we must remember that our children are the living legacy of our deepest, most private values. They will replicate the respect we show them, and they will exploit the neglect we try to hide. Stories like Carson's are not just tales of forensic retribution. They are warnings wrapped in the guise of entertainment. They peel back the wallpaper of the American family and force us to examine the framing underneath. If you find yourself captivated by the psychology of these familial fractures, if you want to understand the intricate dance between betrayal and boundary setting, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel Linda Vengeance, where we dissect the anatomy of trust, the mechanics of loyalty, and the quiet power of those who refuse to be collateral damage. We explore the dark corners of domestic life, not to revel in the ruin, but to learn how to build something unbreakable in its place. As the Wisconsin sun sets, casting long, fading shadows across the polished oak floors of a house bought with stolen funds and reclaimed by synthetic resolve, the silence lingers. It is the heavy, expectant silence of a closed ledger. But the echoes of that shattered family remain, drifting through the quiet spaces of our own homes. When you walk past your child's bedroom tonight, or when you sit across from your spouse at the breakfast table tomorrow, look closely at the invisible threads connecting you. Are those threads woven with honesty, accountability, and a love that demands the truth? Or are they fraying under the weight of unspoken expectations and silent resentments? The answer rarely arrives with a dramatic knock on the door. It usually arrives years later, in the quiet, devastating realization of who your children have truly become. We all build a legacy. The only question left is whether it will stand or whether it will turn to ash.